Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is second bite at the cherry in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 71. Maybe it was the shock and indignation on Sasuke's face, but Sakura didn't stop laughing right away. She watched him stammer, clearly not expecting that reaction from her, and it just sent her into further hysterics. Of course, after all this time, after everything they'd been through, Sasuke would just walk in and demand a fight. Don't laugh. Sasuke demanded, stepping forward with a fist raised. Do you think this is a joke? Do you think you're so much better now that you've fought Itachi? Ah, so that was it. He'd heard the rumors. Maybe Orochimaru had even used the rumors to his advantage. Sakura had left the village and gotten strong enough to face Itachi, so Sasuke had truly made the right decision in leaving too. If he could beat Sakura. And he'd always been far stronger than she could ever reach. Was he really feeling threatened by her now? Did he, like Naruto, see her as a challenge? Sakura wiped her eyes and forced herself to be calm. Hello, Sasuke. She spoke, still out of breath from laughter. How are you? It's been a year since we've seen each other, hasn't it? You look well. What have you been up to? What sort of weird things has Orochimaru been teaching you? None of that matters. Sasuke hissed. I told you, I want you to dash. I believe, Sai spoke up, stepping away from his corner with his usual fake smile on his face. Sakura is attempting to demonstrate the proper etiquette upon seeing an old friend after a long period of absence. Perhaps you might attempt to reciprocate. This quieted Sasuke for a moment. He stammered again, glaring at Sai before turning his attention back to Sakura. Hello. He didn't meet her eyes, then, and as Sakura watched him she saw it, saw the boy that got flustered whenever she or Naruto learned something embarrassing about him, whenever he'd missed something that should have been obvious, whenever a mission didn't go quite as planned. There was still the boy from Team 7, deep down in there. The boy she'd loved, once. Maybe Orochimaru had been trying to pull him away from such things, but, somehow, it was all still there. And Sakura realized why a moment later, when an out-of-breath Karin came dashing into the room. Sasuke, she wheezed. I told you not to harass her, she just got here. I was, just saying hello. No, you were challenging her to a fucking fight, I know how you get. Karin jabbed Sasuke's chest with her finger. You heard she was here and you got so damn excited that you didn't think she might be tired from the journey, huh? Or that she might not be in a position to just run around and spar with the Otokage's ward, that it might look bad on her. HN. Sakura's laughter turned into giggles as the Uzumaki admonished him. Maybe a year ago she might have been jealous at how close Karin seemed to Sasuke, but at the moment it was simply humorous. Sasuke had gone from peacocking to withdrawing his head into his collar, looking more like a child being scolded and less the menacing Uchiha air. Did you at least apologize to her? Karin finished with a huff. Sasuke looked back to Sakura, and there was still a gleam in his eyes. She could predict exactly what was coming next. I'm not going to apologize for being honest. I want to fight her. Karin groaned. I swear, working with you is like herding cats. Sakura, you have got to tell me how you managed him. I didn't. Sakura admitted sheepishly. He and Naruto were at it all the time, actually. I kind of just stood by and watched. Well, no wonder he's all worked up, if he's never seen you fight he's probably all sorts of confused about the rumors going around. I've seen you fight. Sasuke added. You weren't, he hesitated, but Sakura knew exactly what he'd planned on saying. I wasn't strong. She finished for him. I wasn't talented. I wasn't a genius. I wasn't a stubborn, chakra-pumped beast like Naruto. Well, believe it or not, Sasuke, I've been training too. If you thought I was just going to stand by while you and Naruto got stronger, then you're an idiot. Did you really fight Itachi? Sakura sighed. Of course he wouldn't let that go. Itachi, his brother, the reason he was here. Yes. She answered honestly. But it wasn't much of a fight. I accidentally found a rather stupid way out of his genjutsu and then I broke the cliff he was standing on. The fight almost killed me. Whatever you've heard, It was probably completely exaggerated. Sasuke nodded, and in a way he looked relieved. I see. He answered. So you didn't. Like I said. Not much of a fight. Still want to take me on? Sasuke met her eyes again, and this time she saw it, the flare-up of the Sharingan. It sent shivers down her spine. She'd fought enough of those demise, and she really wasn't keen on fighting them again. But despite this, something about Sasuke's response made her feel differently. Yes. It was the same as when Naruto had declared his own desire to challenge her. The same as when she'd faced down Lee in the Chunin exams and had been able to match him, when once she'd thought his own strength unobtainable. There was something about her companions thinking her worthy of challenging that warmed her heart in a way she couldn't quite explain. But, Karen made good points. She wasn't exactly tired from her journey, but she was certain that going around challenging other shinobi wouldn't exactly look good on her as an ambassador intending to keep a neutral position. Orochimaru probably wouldn't say no to the spar. In fact, she figured he'd enjoy seeing his prodigy face up against her, or even just get a chance to see her own skills in action. But how would it reflect on her if she took up every challenge thrown her way? Or maybe she was looking at it wrong, maybe it would show other nations that she was strong. She frowned, biting her lip as she considered things. But before she could even think of an answer, it was Sai that spoke up again. I don't know. What makes you think you are worthy of challenging our most esteemed head ambassador? Sasuke looked annoyed as he addressed Sai again. Do you not know who I am? I know you're the Uchiha Scion, that you've trained under Orochimaru, and that you're not very respecting of privacy. It's more than you know about me. It's more than you even know about Sakura. It appears as though you have little idea of what she's done since you've parted ways. A truly good shinobi would have attempted to gather information to use to his advantage before challenging his opponent. You know, Sai smiled again. Asking her if she's been well. Asking about what she's gotten up to since you've parted ways. Asking who she's trained under. That proper etiquette I mentioned earlier. Sai, Sakura warned. You don't need to antagonize him. Sai is right. For the first time, Gaara spoke. He stood up from his seat, looking unusually angry as he moved to stand between her and Sasuke. When we first met, you reminded me of myself. You only thought of one thing. I wasn't surprised when I heard you had left the village to seek power. I was only surprised that Naruto couldn't reach you as he reached me. With a flourish, he unraveled the sand scroll on his back and slammed it onto the ground next to him, causing Karen to flinch. Sai asked if you were worthy of fighting Sakura. You think you've earned some sort of right to take her on. As if nothing you've done in the past matters. As if nothing you've done to her matters. You probably never even thought of her until you heard what she'd begun to do. Meanwhile, Sakura's never stopped thinking of you all this time. She has a lot to tell you. A lot of things you need to hear. But I don't think you're ready for that yet, if all you can think of is testing your mettle. Sasuke's eyes narrowed, briefly, but his determined expression faltered. His Sharingan faded, and his eyes returned to their natural dark color. You weren't supposed to come after me. You were supposed to stay safe. Like I said, you're an idiot if you think I'd just sit back and never change. Sakura answered in turn. But I guess it makes sense, huh? I was always the one you and Naruto were protecting. Even when I tried to protect you, you still had to come to my rescue. When I think back, it's little wonder you didn't think much of me. That you were annoyed by me. There's a part of me that's happy that you want to fight me, you know? But there's also a part of me that's still angry. At you. At myself. At the world for not doing better by all of us. That's why I decided to become an ambassador, you know? I thought, if the world won't work for us, I'll make it work. So I trained. I learned. I got stronger. And I got chosen for something extraordinary. I thought if I got stronger, if I could walk at you and Naruto's side, that you'd accept me, but the truth is, I don't care if you accept me anymore. I'm strong, and I don't need to fight you to know it. She stood, moving her way forward until she was standing directly in front of Sasuke. You really want to fight me so badly? Then sit down with us for dinner and tell me how life has been for you. Then, when we're done, maybe I'll indulge you. Sasuke let out another one of his HN grunts, but did not protest. Sakura wasn't surprised that dinner was a rice-based dish, but she was surprised when the dish used a variety of IWA spices to season the meat and sauces used with it. I figured you might miss a touch of home, Karen told her as they sat. We do trade with IWA when we can, so I figured I could pull some strings. I do it for Sasuke too, sometimes, whenever Orochimaru isn't dragging him to one of his little family dinners. Sasuke glowered at this, though Sakura got the impression it was more bad memories than from Karen specifically. I admit, this really isn't the impression I'd had of Otagakure. Good. I'm doing my damnedest to fix Orochimaru's mess. If I wasn't here helping morale, he wouldn't have a village and he knows it. If he had his way, I doubt he'd keep any loyal shinobi, no matter how strong he is, considering he enjoys using anyone who crosses him as a test subject. And anyone who pleases him too. But not you. I told him if he messed with me, he risks me not be able to make any more Uzumakis. He wants to fuck around with my bloodline, he needs to not kill it off in the process. Naruto's the only other Uzumaki I know, and from what Sasuke told me, I don't know if I'm going to count on him to help me revive the clan. Oh really? Sakura raised an eyebrow in Sasuke's direction. You must be behind on your intel. Naruto's become a bit of a ladies' man since you left. Well, for one lady, at least, but if Ino could come to see Naruto's good qualities, Sakura didn't doubt others might as well. And Hinata had always had a crush on him, as long as she could remember. I don't believe you. Sasuke retorted. You left. Someone had to fill the void, and Naruto is the Hokage's apprentice now. HN Sasuke answered. That's good. You know, I think he might actually faint if he heard you say that. It's what he wanted. Him forgetting about me was his best option. Oh, he definitely didn't forget. Sakura sighed. How could Naruto have forgotten? Especially not after Danzo, after learning everything that had happened to the Uchiha. And that led her to the most pressing dilemma yet. How the fuck was she going to break all of this to Sasuke? It was clear he didn't know. If he knew, he'd be demanding to know more from her. He wouldn't have settled for a dinner, wouldn't have simply asked her about her time with Itachi. Orochimaru likely knew, and must have worked hard to make sure Karen hadn't caught wind of the news herself. Why had Orochimaru kept it from Sasuke? Did Orochimaru fear what Sasuke would do if he knew? And if she told him now, before getting a proper chance to talk with Orochimaru, would that ruin any sliver of a chance she had of convincing the man to sign her treaty? But telling Sasuke was the right thing to do. She'd come here mostly to do that, to give him that which had been stolen from his clan, to make sure he understood in full what Itachi had been forced to do. There was one important factor to consider, she wanted them to be alone when she told him. She wanted it to be a private affair, so he could take the news how he wanted without fear of what others would think. So far, that opportunity had not arisen. Sakura decided then that if she could get Sasuke alone, she would tell him. And if that time didn't come before Orochimaru shoved her out of his village, she'd make time, regardless of the consequences. So, are your companions always this quiet? Sakura was broken from her thoughts by a question from Karen. Sure enough, Gaara was still glowering at Sasuke, and Sai was keeping to himself, though he gave a fake smile to Karen at her question. Gaara's attempting not to let his emotional baggage make an ass of him at the dinner table. He told them. And I am enjoying a good meal. They're not usually this quiet. Sakura clarified as she picked at her food. She still wasn't quite sure what had gotten Gaara so sour. Was he really that upset with how Sasuke had treated her? It had been a while since she'd really talked much about Sasuke at all, before their training in IWA, now that she thought about it. Had he been carrying a grudge all this time? In a way, Sakura could understand. Gaara had once traded blows with Sasuke and Naruto, who'd been protecting her. Maybe he was resentful of the fact that Sasuke had turned around and abandoned her, after everything they'd been through. Maybe, in a strange way, their roles had reversed. Now it was Gaara who was working to protect her, and Sasuke that was itching for a fight. It was admittedly a frustrating turnaround, if she looked at it from Gaara's perspective. Well, she needed to break the ice, then. Otherwise it was going to be an awkward dinner. So, what do you think of Oto, Sasuke? Do you prefer it to Konoha, now that you're here? Sasuke looked at her, not speaking at first. Sakura wondered if he thought she would judge her for his answer. It's the same. He finally replied. Same sort of people. Same sort of living. Sakura had a feeling that wasn't his real answer, but she wouldn't pry where he wasn't comfortable. That's good to know. She answered. My fear with Oto being such a new village was that it might be difficult to integrate it into the treaty, if its hierarchy was too different. If it works, it works. Karen shrugged. I'm not opposed to changing it up, but people like to follow what's familiar. And Orochimaru was always a bit jaded that Sarutobi-sensei favored Namikaze over him for the Hokage position. He wanted to be a Kage, so he just up and made himself one. I can kind of respect the thought. Respect? From Karen Uzumaki? I never would have thought it possible. Sakura almost flinched as Orochimaru's voice seemed to sound directly next to her ear. She felt Gaara's sand rush to curl around her and could hear Sai shuffle for his weapons. Orochimaru just chuckled. So on edge? Is it possible that the ambassadors feel unwelcome in my home? Karen, you clearly haven't been doing your best to accommodate them. It was Karen's response that brought Sakura away from her shock. The girl, somehow, had managed to roll her eyes at Orochimaru's entrance, as though she was used to the man crashing her dinner. Have you considered, Lord Orochimaru, that you're a creepy bastard even at the best of times? It's possible that it was mentioned to me once or twice. Orochimaru answered, and Sakura couldn't help but shiver again as she heard the man run his tongue across his lips. Forgive me, but I couldn't help but get excited when I heard that my Sasuke might be showing off his skills for our guests. She didn't like how Orochimaru referred to Sasuke possessively, and judging by the look on Sasuke's face, he didn't like it either. But he didn't protest it, so Sakura held her tongue. We were talking about potentially having a friendly match, if you would permit it. She answered. I know that Sasuke is quite eager to show off everything you've been teaching him. Is he now? Well, doesn't that just warm the heart? Orochimaru pulled himself into a seat with an unnatural smoothness, and Sakura caught Kabuto lurking nearby out of the corner of her eyes. She wished, for a brief moment, that she'd had a bit of Sai's emotional training, or even some of Gaara's practiced death glare. Both of them hadn't almost squeaked at the sound of the sun in behind them. So, which of you will be playing with Sasuke later? Sakura opened her mouth, but Sai answered before she could. I will be. Sakura whipped her head towards him in disbelief. Just what the hell was he thinking? Even Sasuke seemed baffled at the response, and said as such. I don't care about you. Then handling me shouldn't take much of your time. Sai replied with a smile. But I have to make sure you're worth the head ambassador's time, you see. I wouldn't want her to waste her talents on someone who couldn't even get past her bodyguard. It's the same way I couldn't just walk up to Lord Orochimaru and demand a spar, not without proving myself in some fashion. If Sakura doesn't have to lift a finger, she shouldn't. There was more to it. Sakura could tell by now from Sai's tone that he was choosing his words quite carefully. He hadn't spoken up before at Sasuke's initial challenge, only now that Orochimaru had shown interest in watching. It was obvious now. Sai was trying to make sure she didn't show her abilities to Orochimaru unnecessarily. Orochimaru was, at the moment, more a potential enemy than a potential ally. The less he knew about her and the abilities Jashin had given her, the better. Sasuke, however, Sai seemed to not care as much about. Maybe he was banking on the fact that Sasuke had been Sakura's teammate, once upon a time, and was no friend of Orochimaru. She gave Sasuke a small shrug. It works for me. If you can get through Sai, I'll let you have a round with me. Sasuke was soured by the change, that much was obvious, but Sakura could explain the politics of it later. For now. Dinner has been lovely, but I'd hate to waste your time, Lord Orochimaru. Perhaps, once dinner has settled, we can move on to Sasuke and Sai's spar. Yes. Orochimaru's grin widened. I would very much like to see that. It was no surprise to Sakura that Orochimaru had plenty of underground training arenas. She had no doubt Sasuke was familiar with all of them. Equally less surprising was that these arenas had balcony sections for spectators. Sakura wondered with an inward shudder how often Orochimaru came to watch Sasuke train. There was a twisted logic to the man wanting to keep a close eye on what he considered his future body, but that didn't make it any less horrible. Still, it provided a convenient location to watch Sasuke and Sai face off. The two boys were now standing in the middle of the arena, facing each other. Sasuke looked annoyed, still, at having been denied the fight he really wanted. Sai, for being about to face down yet another Sharingan wielder, looked the picture of calm. "Please don't hold anything back," Sai asked. "And I'll be sure to give you the same honor." "You must be desperate for this fight to be over quickly," Sasuke answered in turn. "Perhaps. I'm sure the student of Lord Orochimaru will prove a more than adequate challenge for me." Sai looked up at Sakura with a smile. "Call the start, would you?" Sure." Sakura blinked. "On the count of 3. Neither of the boys moved. Sakura knew, however, that Sai was more than ready, and she had no doubt Sasuke was as well. "All right. 3, 2, 1, begin." It happened so fast that she almost missed it. Sasuke, no doubt intending to end the fight as quickly as possible, had pumped chakra to his legs and thrown himself forward with incredible speed. It might have worked, too. Sasuke had gotten even faster since she'd seen him last. But Sai had literally been training against opponents that threw themselves wholeheartedly into battle, and it was Sasuke's bad luck that Sai had also decided to lunge forward with all the speed his chakra could give him, swinging his blade in a horizontal arc towards Sasuke's neck. It was likely only thanks to the Sharingan that Sasuke was able to dodge it all, and after they passed, each skidded to a halt at the opposite sides of the arena. "Oops," Sai said nonchalantly. "Were you expecting me to stand still?" "My apologies." Sasuke didn't answer, and it took him only moments to recover before he was lunging for Sai again, though this time not quite as fast. Sakura could see that his attitude had abruptly changed. No longer did Sasuke look annoyed, in fact, he looked intrigued. Sai had shown enough skill, it seemed, to make him interested in the fight. The two clashed again. This time Sasuke had drawn his own katana, and Sakura realized that she was seeing Sasuke use Kenjutsu for the first time since she'd known him. It was interesting to consider that someone here was teaching him how to wield a blade. She just really couldn't picture Orochimaru going through katas with anyone, let alone Sasuke, but who else would Orochimaru have allowed to teach Sasuke anything? Sasuke had gotten skilled, there was no doubt, but in Kenjutsu he'd gotten a bad mashup with Sai. The Hagasha Sai loved to spar with sharp objects, and a katana was a lot simpler than the trick weapons he was no doubt used to dodging around. Not only that, but Sai was likely more aggressive than anyone Sasuke was used to facing. Sai risked getting small cuts in order to play at getting larger hits on his opponent. Not even a minute into the fight, Sai managed to rake the tip of his blade through Sasuke's chest, drawing first blood. Sasuke was lucky, Sakura thought, since the Hagasha Sai typically used painful poisons on their weapons in real fights. Despite the minor wound, Sasuke did not lose face. His Sharingan whirled, and he simply started up the spar anew. He wasn't using any jutsu, Sakura noted. Only the blade and whatever chakra he needed to keep pace with. Was he trying to preserve? Hoping to be able to use jutsu in the fight against her, should he win this one? Or maybe it was a statement, he didn't need to waste chakra defeating Sai. Such an aggressive fighting style. Orochimaru commented next to her, watching the battle with that eerie predatory gaze. I would have expected a member of Root to act more cautiously. He's not Root anymore, Sakura countered. At the moment, no one is. True, too true. I'd had my suspicions that you'd found some sort of training in Yogakur, but I admit, I couldn't quite determine what until I saw that necklace of yours. He fights very similarly to an old acquaintance of mine. Hiden, Sakura thought to herself. The two hadn't been part of Akatsuki together for long, but it had apparently been long enough. And it made sense, why wouldn't Orochimaru have been drawn to Hiden's immortality? She kept her eyes on the clashing blades below, but now her mind was on the conversation. Orochimaru was speaking to her without her prompting it. This was her chance. A chance to continue to intrigue him. I would ask why you haven't sought out the Enclave yourself, but I suppose the draw of Kagaya's power would be far more appealing. Would you rather follow a god or become one? Being a god comes with quite a lot of responsibility. I wouldn't expect to hear an ambassador complaining of responsibility. It seems to me that you're simply lacking in ambition. Now that's one I haven't heard yet. Sakura couldn't help but chuckle. Everyone else seemed to think she was too ambitious. I am trying to unify the shinobi world. And wouldn't it be so much easier if you were a god? So what, are you saying you intend to be competition? Was there ever any doubt? Orochimaru's grin returned, though his eyes were still fixated on the battle below. Well, I had doubts, when I heard about your intent to run around and make peace. I thought it a boring activity. And yet, Sakura agreed. It was strange, hearing Orochimaru talk so nonchalantly. He'd been chatty when she'd met him in the Forest of Death, but she'd considered that an intimidation tactic. Maybe he was actually just naturally wordy? Or, more likely, he liked hearing himself talk. I know that you have a lot to talk to my Sasuke about. Sakura felt herself freeze. Of course Orochimaru would have known she planned to tell him, she'd been stupid not to think he would. He wouldn't believe it from me, you know. Even though I've never been anything but honest with him. Sakura doubted that. You do have something of a reputation. Naturally. Orochimaru gave a small bow of his head. But you might give me a run for my money, Sharingan Breaker. Sakura inwardly groaned. Of course that nickname had stuck. Orochimaru might have even started it, if only to fuel Sasuke's desire to get stronger. Sakura faced down Itachi. Sakura beat Itachi. I suppose there's worse nicknames to have. But you can see, of course, why your abilities might interest me. Despite what some may have told you, I'm a reasonable man, Sakura Haruno. Wait, where was he going with this? First Itachi, then Danzo. No pushovers, either of them. Each equipped with similar assets. He'd known about Danzo's Sharingan, of course he did. Sakura had to wonder if Orochimaru's research had helped Danzo craft that disaster of an arm. I'm admittedly curious. You have information that intrigues me. And you desire something from me. I could make this visit very easy for you. Sakura tensed. She knew where this was going now, even if she hadn't been able to see before. Of course Orochimaru would be interested in that. Simply tell me how you managed to overcome the genjutsu of the Sharingan, and I shall humor your little peace treaty. This was a man who had faced down Itachi Uchiha and lost. Who coveted the Sharingan, but now knew that it could be overcome. Orochimaru was worried, Sakura realized. Worried that if he took Sasuke's body, there would still be people capable of challenging him. Her reputation had made her a threat without her even knowing it. She didn't really have anything unique in either of those scenarios. Jashin had helped her purge her body of chakra to break Itachi's technique, and Danzo's Izanami had been broken with simple logic. But Orochimaru didn't know that. He no doubt thought it was something fancy. A bloodline limit, maybe, or a jutsu Sakura had invented that granted her a measure of protection. Orochimaru needed the knowledge, or else his future reign would never be secure. Sakura had something Orochimaru wanted. But, was it worth giving? Her treaty signed, yes, but if Orochimaru learned her tricks for fighting Sharingan, what would that mean for the future? I will need time to consider your offer, Lord Orochimaru, generous as it is. Sakura stammered an answer, attempting to turn her focus back to the fight in order to steel her own nerves. A shinobi's techniques are their life, after all. How true that is. And you are my honored guest, of course. You may stay here until you give your answer. Underhandedness covered by false generosity. What Orochimaru was truly saying was that her welcome would be up the instant her mind was made. And Orochimaru would likely not tolerate much delay. She swallowed hard, but nodded. I thank you for your generosity, Lord Orochimaru. I shall get you your answer as quickly as I am able. It would do, for now. And in the meanwhile, there was a battle raging below, a fury of sword swipes back and forth across the arena. Sai was strong, but so was Sasuke, and Sakura wondered if the battle would simply come down to a matter of stamina. A battle of wills, and all the while she was fighting a battle of her own. Give Orochimaru my secrets to countering the Sharingan, or fail in winning Otogakure to my treaty, possibly having to bank on Karin one day taking up the Cage Mantle? She'd come here with little hope of getting Orochimaru to sign it at all. Now that there was a tangible option in her grasp, Sakura was even more uncertain. Chapter 72. I've always hated snakes. Gaara understood the sentiment now more than ever, as he listened to Orochimaru speak. There was an archetype he had learned about during his time with the Tanuki, a certain characterization that had been referred to as ACB. ACB was a plant, an unassuming thing with quaint white flowers that simply looked pretty to the untrained eye, but Gaara knew from his brief poisons training in Suna that the flowers were toxic and potentially lethal. Similarly so were those of the ACB archetype, they drew you in, offering gifts, honeyed words, pretty promises, but were inevitably self-serving and detrimental to those they drew in. The Uchiha had already drank of the ACB nectar, and only time would tell if he would realize it for the poison that it was. Gaara didn't necessarily fault him for being drawn in by Orochimaru. Even the Tanuki had warned him about Orochimaru's sword and how to deal with them, especially since, in the grander game of shinobi politics, they were bound to run across them more often than not. The ACB personality desired power and influence and were good at getting it. Lying was second nature to them, but even more so than lying was their ability to twist the truth to serve their own needs, to use honesty with as much finesse as deceit. Orochimaru didn't lie often, and that was what Sakura needed to learn to navigate. Orochimaru likely would sign Sakura's treaty in exchange for information about navigating the Sharingan, but of course was likely leaving out that signing a treaty didn't necessarily guarantee he'd honor it. Gaara trusted Sakura to know this, though he would still bring up his thoughts with her later. If he had learned anything from the Tanuki, Sakura didn't just need a bodyguard. She needed advisors. Sai, to Gaara's secret dismay, had already begun to fill that role before Gaara had even realized it needed filling. But in his own defense, the two of them both knew that Gaara was the far superior bodyguard. Time at the Enclave had given them both what they'd needed. Gaara had learned about navigating and understanding people. Sai had learned about killing them. And as Sai clashed with the Uchiha below and Gaara in turn analyzed Orochimaru here, he realized that they'd gotten lucky. He was much more prepared to deal with a snake now than he'd ever been. I don't know. I still say you should kill him. Gaara suppressed the desire to chuckle. Some things never changed. Killing Orochimaru likely would make things easier, if they could attempt it. Karin also exuded ACB personality at times, but unlike Orochimaru, she clearly wasn't a sociopath. She would be a far more reasonable Otokage at first glance, and also wasn't actively trying to become God. A sentiment that had made Shukaku snarl in disgust upon Orochimaru's mention. Kagaya's power will destroy him or destroy us. You think I'm scary? Try 9 of me packed into him. Gaara was usually hesitant to admit fear. But Orochimaru, with that kind of power? That did scare him. It didn't seem as though he was very close to success, however, which Shukaku had insisted meant they should strike before he became any more dangerous. It would be considered a public service. There wasn't any nation that didn't fear Orochimaru in some capacity, so wasn't it just doing the world a favor to get rid of him? The answer was an unfortunate no. Killing Orochimaru in the middle of treaty negotiations was the antithesis of what they stood for. Killing him without due cause, without the explicit backing of all the allied nations, it could destroy everything they'd built. If Sakura could simply kill whomever she disagreed with, who wouldn't she kill to keep the peace? It would be an alliance raised in fear, and maybe a few of the newly signed-on nations had signed on to avoid Sakura's wrath after the Danzo incident, but Sakura had never intended it to go that way. An alliance of mutual respect and understanding. Sakura wasn't just here to try and force Orochimaru to sign a piece of paper. She was here to make him respect her. That was the game she played, and the odds were stacked against her far more here than anywhere else. They'd all known coming in that they were playing with a loser's hand to start. The two had stopped talking now, content to watch the spar below. It was a sham of a spar, in a way. Sasuke was avoiding using much chakra so that he might go all out against Sakura, and Sai was avoiding using many of the tricks he'd learned through the Hagashisai in what Gaara figured was a far too subtle attempt to tell Sasuke that he wasn't worth his time. Both were being stubborn and both were being arrogant. It was a little bit funny. Perhaps the most passive-aggressive duel he'd seen in his life. Sai is drawing it out. Exhausting the Uchiha. Even if he loses, the Uchiha will be too tired to give Sakura a true fight. And thus, Sakura wouldn't have to show her full capabilities in front of Orochimaru, and Sasuke would still get his spar. That was admittedly clever, though it was becoming more boring by the minute. Gaara let his gaze wander around the room, a habit he'd learned in the Tanuki. Memorize your surroundings, memorize the people in them. See how they moved, where they looked, what they were interested in. Orochimaru watched Sasuke with a disgustingly predatory gaze, but that was to be expected. Sakura, too, was intent on the match. And then there was that other man, Kabuto, who was just as snakish as his master. Gaara wasn't quite as familiar with him, but he'd heard enough from Sakura to know to be wary. A Konoha spy, which meant he was more than capable of playing up a persona to get in close to others. And right now, Kabuto was distracted. Very, very distracted. He hid it well, but Gaara had spent the past few months learning to watch the movement of eyes and the subtle twitches of the body. Kabuto was pretending to watch the match, but like clockwork he kept looking towards a nearby wall. Funnily enough, it looked like he was looking at a clock. It was nearing the end of the hour, so Kabuto was likely expected somewhere, or was managing something time-sensitive. Another gross experiment of Orochimaru's? But if so, why hide his worry over the time? Sakura had her eye on the match. Right now, Gaara decided, he would watch this Kabuto. His suspicions were confirmed at 5 minutes to the hour, at which point Kabuto quietly approached Orochimaru and whispered something too quiet for Gaara to hear. With a short bow, Kabuto excused himself. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it really was just another of Orochimaru's experiments. But Gaara was curious now, and he hadn't learned spying and information gathering from the Tanuki just to not use it when something piqued his interest. He slowly closed one eye, the eye furthest from Orochimaru and out of the man's view. He felt Shukaku's energy rise in tandem with his own, though he really only needed a little bit of energy to connect his optic nerve to his sand. From there, he sent his sand in the thinnest possible cloud out the door, until he could reform his third eye and send it after Kabuto. He was distracted briefly by Orochimaru licking his lips, seen out of the corner of his other eye. Sasuke, it seemed, had just landed a glancing blow on Sai. It wasn't much, Sai had come home with far worse. Gaara glanced down just in time to see Sai land a blow on Sasuke in turn. Both were going for non-lethal, it seemed, but that didn't mean they weren't aiming to make a few scars. He should have used poisons and knocked the idiot out. No, Gaara thought with a smile. That would have just pissed Sasuke off later. His third eye was getting an interesting glimpse of the tunnels beneath Otogakuer, and Gaara did his best to remember every twist and turn, every door that he came across. He could have Sai map it later, for their convenience, especially if Kabuto was heading somewhere interesting. But the most interesting thing that Gaara saw wasn't Kabuto at all, but Karin. He doubted Kabuto had noticed. Even Gaara hadn't expected to catch a glimpse of the Uzumaki girl in the vents of all places. But it seemed as though he wasn't the only one monitoring Kabuto, and that alone was something of a relieving thought. He'd have to question her about it later. Kabuto eventually came to a halt at a door. He looked both ways before opening it and entering, and Gaara sent his sand slinking in under the door after him. The room looked more like a closet than anything interesting. There were boxes of medical equipment, but they were dusty, likely not used in some time. Kabuto moved to the middle of the room before kneeling. Then, to Gaara's surprise, something appeared in the room. It looked like a warped version of a man, but not solid, more like a Bunshin, but unlike a Bunshin, this image seemed to flicker like a flame and showed very little detail other than what looked to be two eyes. Lord Sasori, Kabuto announced. Sakura Harino and the Jinhiriki have arrived in Otogakuer. Gaara had to stop himself from freezing up. Sasori, that was a name he'd learned well in the recent months. Sasori of the Red Sand, who'd murdered the third Kaze Kage, who'd mastered the art of puppetry before turning against his village and going to join Akatsuki. Kabuto was a demmed Akatsuki spy and he was leading one of the most lethal men alive right to them. Finally, Sasori replied, his voice heavy with a distortion that Gaara didn't quite understand. She kept us waiting for far too long. We will proceed with the extraction of the Jinhira key. Ensure Orochimaru does not interfere. And Harano Deidara will deal with her personally. We will take the Jinhira key and she will be eliminated. You may do what you wish with the spare. Understood. The visage of Sasori disappeared, and Kabuto rose to his feet. Before the man could turn around, Gaara pulled his eye out of the room and dismissed his connection. This was bad. The first and most pressing matter being that Akatsuki knew where they were and were actively coming for them. Sasori, it seemed, had been waiting for them to arrive. This wasn't as much of a surprise as Gaara would have liked it to be. Sakura was trying to be transparent about her motives so as not to take uninformed countries off guard with her arrival. But the way Kabuto had spoken to Sasori made it seem as though they'd planned on their arrival here at Oto, which suggested one of two things. The first, and least likely, was that Kabuto was working for Sasori in truth and was merely pretending to work for Orochimaru, using the Sunin's resources to aid Akatsuki. Gaara doubted Kabuto could have kept this secret for so long without Orochimaru getting suspicious, but it was a possibility he couldn't discount. Following this scenario suggested that Orochimaru and Akatsuki were something at odds, which had a bit of sense. Orochimaru was ex-Akatsuki, implying he broke up with them for a reason, and maybe Akatsuki was wary of getting Orochimaru's ire turned on them in the middle of extracting the Jinhira key. He couldn't imagine that scenario ending well for Kabuto. The instant Orochimaru learned that Akatsuki were moving in his village behind his back, he'd know there was a traitor and root them out. Maybe Kabuto was prepared to die for Sasori, but Gaara knew most people had an instinct of self-preservation. Plus, Orochimaru wasn't stupid. The odds of him not knowing about Kabuto's connection were low, too low to linger on. The second option was that Orochimaru knew about Kabuto's connection and was using it to his advantage. This, Gaara could see making sense. He weasels information about the Sharingan from Sakura, signs her treaty, and then hands her over to Akatsuki. No need to worry about the treaty if the ambassadors were dead, and perhaps that helps him make amends with Akatsuki. Of course, Kabuto didn't exactly suggest that Sasori should delay, but with whatever that technique was, Gaara got the sense that Sasori wasn't exactly here yet, simply close enough to send a weird transmission. It was something that Sakura's visions should have warned them about, and yet Sakura was still stuck dreaming about some stupid letter from some unknown shinobi about an unknown force. Gaara found himself resenting the odd religion at times. He wasn't quite sure what he thought of Jashin overall, but right now he was simply annoyed. And then there was the matter of Karen. She was spying on Kabuto as well, which meant that it was possible she knew about this as well and kept it from them. But why cozy up with them if she knew Akatsuki was coming to see them dead? Not enough information, brat. And we can't afford to waste time screwing around. Shikaka was right. Here they were, watching Sasuke and Sai spar like it was a casual hobby, when their enemies were getting closer by the second. They needed time to prepare, but on the chance that Orochimaru had set this up as a trap for them, Gaara couldn't let the man know that he'd caught on. He put on an air of boredom, shifting against the railing so that he rested his chin against his hand. Then, he spoke, letting his voice carry across the room. This is a waste of time. Stop playing around with him and get this over with. He saw Sakura shoot him a confused glance, but ignored it. He'd have time to explain later. Sai, too, looked momentarily confused, but thankfully seemed to catch on. We can't let Gaara get too bored, can we? You know better than anyone what happens if he gets upset, don't you, Sasuke? Fine. Sasuke's eyes flashed red, and the boy lunged forward with renewed speed and vigor. Admittedly, Gaara could see that even Sai couldn't keep up with the Uchiha's onslaught. That was perhaps expected. Sai had really only had about 3 months of aggressive Kenjutsu training, while Sasuke had been with Orochimaru for over a year now. That, coupled with the Sharingan's enhancement to his reflexes, made Sasuke an opponent that would be far too formidable if it was just a Kenjutsu match. It was about another minute before Sai was swept onto the ground with a well-placed kick, halted from further action by Sasuke's blade at his throat. "You're done," Sasuke announced. "Sakura next." "Ah, I suppose you are the superior with a blade," Sai replied, showing off his fake smile. "Perhaps I shall ask you for some tips in the future." Sasuke grunted in response before sheathing his blade and turning to face the stands above. Not even offering a hand to help Sai up, Gaara noted, which bothered him. Hadn't Orochimaru even taught the boy manners? Sai stood on his own, reaching into his pocket to pull out his notebook and... "Oh fuck. Looks like Uchiha might end up getting pissed after all. Your style is reminiscent of a popular Konoha style," Sai commented casually, using his very unique paintbrush to write in his notebook. "But there are some moderations that remind me of an old Suna dueling technique. You've been teaching him quite a bit, haven't you, Lord Orochimaru?" "I would spare nothing from my Sasuke," Orochimaru answered in turn, sporting a smirk. Gaara couldn't tell if it was simple pride in the compliment, or if he'd caught on to Sai's trick. "How unfortunate, then, that you didn't teach him not to turn his back on an opponent that hasn't officially surrendered." Sai brought the brush to his mouth, pushing the button that allowed it to quickly morph into a hidden blowgun. Sasuke moved to react, but not even he could draw a blade quick enough to stop a small dart from piercing his skin. He yanked the dart out, eyes spinning red as he prepared to fight again, but Sai simply waited with a smile. "What I've just injected is a diluted mixture of fugu poison. It's a very potent neurotoxin at high doses, but the Hagashusai have made a mixture that is far less effective. Still, without an antidote, you'll be paralyzed for at least a day." "Bastard!" Sasuke hissed, gripping at the spot where the dart had hit. Gaara watched as a black mark suddenly spread out from Sasuke's body, the curse mark Sakura had spoken of. It seemed to be reacting to the poison, even staving it off. Sakura had learned to treat that particular poison at the Enclave, and those struck with it were usually down within seconds. "The Uchiha boy's become a little monster since we saw him last, hasn't he?" Orochimaru was shaking, Gaara realized, though it took a moment for him to figure out that the Sannin was laughing. "Looks like my Sasuke needs a bit more training than I thought." The man spoke between chuckles. "What a foolish mistake, predator turning its back on cornered prey. He should have known better. By Jashin, they're both idiots." Sakura cursed aloud. Below, Sasuke's mark had fully spread across his body, but even the power of the curse wasn't enough to stave off Sai's poison. Sasuke fell to the ground in a rigid slump just as Sakura pushed herself over the railing to land beside him. She pulled out a small scroll, within which were many vials of antidote to the various poisons Sai had brought with him. "Even if I give him the antidote, he won't be fit for any more fighting today." "Whoops," Sai answered with a shrug. "I suppose he should have taken me more seriously. He is going to kill you later. Next time I'll use a stronger poison." "How about no poisons, we're here on diplomatic mission." The two continued to bicker as Sakura began to inject antidote into the paralyzed Uchiha. Gaara couldn't help but sigh with relief. Despite Sakura's anger, and despite the fact that Sasuke would no doubt be raring for a rematch, things had been finished quickly. If they retired now, he could warn Sakura about the Akatsuki, maybe even tell Sasuke why he'd insisted the match be ended so quickly. Would the brat aid us against Akatsuki? Surely, seeing as his brother is of their number. It would be for personal gain to capture one. I suppose that's true. I'll send Karen over to tend to him. Orochimaru commented dryly, looking towards Gaara as he did. Perhaps it is good you arrived here. It has shown me where my training is lacking. I'm surprised it wasn't you that desired to fight the boy. Gaara simply shook his head. No. That time had passed. Gaara didn't want to fight Sasuke. If anything, he wanted nothing to do with him. Sasuke Uchiha, Gaara had simply lost interest. And after everything he'd done to Sakura. How curious. Orochimaru answered. So it is true that your sloppy seal was fixed. Shukaku's bloodlust no longer steeps the air. A pity. You were a most interesting weapon. The Sannin turned to leave, but as he did, Gaara felt Shukaku's energy writhe within him, until Shukaku was speaking through him in a hefty growl. I'd remember your own advice, Snake. Don't turn your back on us. Orochimaru stopped his retreat for a single second, glancing over his shoulder. He still had a smug smile on his face, but for a moment, the briefest of moments, Gaara knew what he'd seen. They'd made the man shiver. I cannot believe you turned your back on an opponent, Sasuke, you absolute idiot. I cannot even begin to tell you how badly this fucked up your chakra coils. It's going to take at least a week before you're back to normal. Why the fuck did you try and use your curse mark to stave it off? Gaara squinted as he took on the full force of Karin's lecture. Much like Naruto, this girl was loud and she could rant for seemingly hours. At the very least, the lecture wasn't directed at him. And you? Karin turned to jab Sai in the chest. Sai'd been keeping a very smug look on his face since the battle. Perhaps it had been a cheap shot, but Sasuke wouldn't be able to live it down, even if Sai never won a match against him again. That was a cheap move dash. Shinobi. Sai countered. He asked for a fight and I gave one. If he can't dodge a little dart, he's not ready to face Sakura. And that's not the point, we need him. You have no idea what's going to happen here in the next week. Akatsuki. Karin froze, Sakura froze, everyone seemed to freeze as Gaara spoke up. Gaara simply met Karin's eyes. You know about it. Time to talk. Why yeah, I know about it. I was going to talk about it once we were all together, but this one had to go picking a fight. She rapped Sasuke's forehead with her knuckles, but all Sasuke could do at the moment was grumble in response. His motion was still limited, even with the antidote. Akatsuki's been planning on moving in here for a while now to try and nab you. They'd expected you 3 months ago but you threw them off when you stopped in you for so long. They've been taking mercenary missions in the area ever since, waiting for you to come out of hiding. I think they even reconned in you but wherever you were at, they certainly couldn't find you. You could have led with that when I first got here. Sakura protested. Yeah, and then you would have run off. I've got a plan. I've had a plan ready, and that plan involves all of us working together to get what we want. Sasuke gets someone to interrogate about his brother, you get help dealing with the S-ranked criminals that want you dead, and I get to enact my first step towards taking over this country. You still could have led with that when I got here. It is not my fault the Uchiha moron over here has a single brain cell left in his head and jumps into fights the first chance he gets. And I can't risk Orochimaru hearing about any of this. He could be listening now. Silencing seals on the room, look at the walls. Ah, I was wondering about those. Sai stood up, pulling out his notebook, this time to actually sketch, as he looked at the designs that snaked along the walls and across the door to the room. I'd heard the Uzumaki were seal masters but I've unfortunately only met one before you, and he barely even knew what a seal was. Would you be interested in discussing techniques with me? Sai, now is not the time. Sakura replied through gritted teeth. How many days do we have until Akatsuki gets here? Or is it hours? No idea. Karin admitted. Kabuto didn't mention. What does Kabuto have to do with this? Oh yeah, that bastard's been playing double agent for months, maybe even years now. Sasori thinks Kabuto is playing spy for him on Orochimaru, Orochimaru thinks Kabuto is spying on Sasori for him. It's a hilarious mess. I don't think anyone knows who Kabuto is working for, least of all Kabuto. Great. Just great. Sakura threw up her hands as she began to pace the room. So Kabuto's an enemy no matter how we look at it. Orochimaru will probably let Akatsuki storm in and take whatever they want, and we don't know how much time we have until we're fighting for our lives. That's why we have to follow my plan. Karin insisted. Only problem is Sasuke here being out of commission. I was counting on having him. Fuck it. Sakura sat herself down in front of Sasuke before shooting a glare at Karin. What is about to happen stays here, got it? I got it. Good. Sasuke, don't move a muscle. Sakura put one hand against Sasuke's forehead, the other reaching up to touch her amulet. Gaara recognized the stance. Her breathing began to even out, and Sakura held very, very still. Within moments, her skin began to darken, strange patterns spiraling out across her body until her skin was a mismatch of black marks. She was calling upon natural energy, using Jashin's power to heal. Gaara saw her grit her teeth as she began to work her chakra into Sasuke's body. Jashin's power allowed her to heal injury, so long as she could suffer through the pain the injury caused. Sasuke wasn't in much pain now, granted, but the Fugu poison was admittedly nasty, and if Karen had been correct about the damage to Sasuke's chakra coils, that meant the injuries wouldn't be easy to fix. He saw Sasuke's eyes widen slightly at Sakura's drastic change, but thankfully he did not move. Instead, the whole room went quiet as Sakura worked. A minute later, Sakura released her technique with a sharp inhale of breath, causing the markings to quickly recede from her skin. As she did, Gaara saw Sasuke tentatively move his hands. "Healing?" he asked, confused. "How?" "Akeki Genkai." "No," Sakura answered, out of breath. "A somewhat generous god is the best answer I can give you. Can you manipulate your chakra?" Another moment passed, but Sasuke nodded. "Yes." "Good. Now, Karen, you mentioned a plan." Karen looked as baffled as Sasuke, but managed to put her thoughts aside as Sakura addressed her. "Right, the plan. This changes things a little bit. I'll need to talk skill sets with each of you, but I've got the bare bones ready to go and build upon. The two Akatsuki members that will be coming our way are Deidara and Sasori. Explosions and poisons. If my assessment is correct, Deidara will attempt to separate Gaara and Sakura from each other. Bombs don't work well against sand, which means he'll probably try to take Sakura down while Sasori neutralizes Gaara, probably similar to the way Sai neutralized Sasuke today. So Sasuke, I guess this was a bit of a trial run. Sasori's poisons are going to be way more lethal than Sai's. If you end up facing him I'll be more prepared." Sasuke grumbled. "Sakura, do you think you'd be able to play poison control if you faced Sasori?" "Potentially, but it depends. If it's fast acting, my technique may not be quick enough," Sakura answered. "I can't bring people back from the dead. If someone's gone, they're gone. Still, you've got the best chance of being a secret weapon against Sasori. If his poisons won't work, that'll make him more manageable for whomever is fighting him. Whatever they try, Sakura, you need to be on the team facing him." "Got it." Sakura nodded. "What about Orochimaru? Is he going to just stand back and let us fight, or should we expect interference?" "Kabuto was ordered to prevent interference," Gaara pointed out. Karen shot him a look, to which Gaara shrugged in turn. "You weren't the only one watching him today. Right? Sheesh. I guess I should be grateful you're competent. Anyway, Gaara's right, Kabuto's been ordered to prevent interference. Which means we theoretically won't have to worry about Orochimaru. But you mentioned this being your first step towards taking over the country? Doesn't that mean Orochimaru needs to be involved one way or another?" "Right again." Karen smiled. "Now pay attention closely, all of you." She drew the three of them closer, pulling out a large scroll and unraveling it on the ground in front of them. The scroll was blank until she bit her thumb and let blood drip onto it, upon which the scroll began to reveal a full set of writing and drawings within. "Oh," Sakura said with a grin. "Oh, you are thinking ahead?" "Yup," Karen answered. "Like I said, pay close attention. This is where the plan gets interesting." Chapter 73. The most comprehensive notes had come from Oniki. Sakura had remembered Deidara being mentioned once or twice in her time there, mostly in regards to various things he'd blown up in or outside of the village. Deidara wasn't just a bomber, he was the bomber. He viewed explosions as a form of art and had even stolen an Iwagaku or Kinjutsu that allowed him to mix his chakra with clay to make, well, even more explosives, outside of the typical, explosive release, Kekki Genkai that he'd mastered during his time in the IWA Explosion Corps. Oniki had referred to Deidara as a talented shitstain of a brat, which Sakura had translated to mean that he'd been fond of Deidara before his rather violent departure. Haiden was fond enough of Deidara that he'd asked Sakura as kindly as he was capable to not kick his ass beyond salvation. As far as Haiden knew, Deidara had been bullied into joining Akatsuki by that crepe-ass pretty boy Uchiha, which meant that there was a fair possibility that Deidara could be persuaded out of helping Akatsuki if the right motivation presented itself. There were two problems with that assumption, however. 1. Deidara hated Uchiha. Hated them. And Sasuke was with them, which meant that regardless of anything Sakura presented, it was likely that Sasuke's mere presence might just push Deidara into an explosive rage anyway. 2. And this was the cincher, how the hell was she going to get a chance to try diplomacy if this man was going to literally come in bombs blazing? She wasn't stupid, and Karen wasn't stupid. Deidara and Sasori had likely done their research regarding her, Gaara, and Sai, and their tactics would likely be divide and conquer. Deidara would try to scatter them, Sasori would pick off Gaara when they weren't looking, which would leave them down a protective Jinhuriki and at the mercy of very big booms. And speaking of Sasori, Puppet Master, that much Temari had been able to account for in her own documentation. Master of poisons, hidden within a large armored puppet called Hiriko that was as deadly as it was defensive, head of the Akatsuki's foremost spy network, veteran of the Third Shinobi War, there was little that Sasori didn't have under his belt, and though Sakura was strategically best suited to help whatever team was taking him down, that didn't mean she was extremely nervous about doing so. She'd trained at the Enclave for several months, yes, she'd studied under the Tsuchikage, yes, but this was Akatsuki. She was allowed to be worried. She was allowed to over-prepare. She was allowed to. Sakura, go to sleep. Sakura admittedly started as Gaara's voice distracted her from her notes. She had been mulling over these notes for several hours now, but still. You're one to talk, you know. I have Shukaku. He lets you sleep now, just because you grew up not sleeping doesn't mean you shouldn't be trying to catch up now. He is the best suited for night watch. Sai commented from across the room. He doesn't experience sleep deprivation like we do. Shut it, Dart Boy, you're still in the doghouse for pissing off Uchiha. Not my fault he doesn't have Sharingan eyes on the back of his head. Why don't you go to bed? Sakura groaned. Still, another look from Gaara had Sakura packing up her notes for the night and turning in. He was right. If she wasn't well rested, she wouldn't be at her best for taking on Akatsuki when they came, and no amount of preparation would solve that. The problem was, well, a certain vision was making it very difficult to sleep. Shinobi are cursed to seek violence. I will bring about the peace we have desired for so long. Sakura woke with a start 3 hours after her initial turn-in for the night, just as breathless and anxious as the first time she'd had the dream weeks ago. The anxiety soon faded into anger that she still didn't know why Jashin was so insistent on this vision when there were a million more useful visions she could be tapping into instead, like maybe Deidara or Sasori or even fucking Orochimaru at this point. The anger slowly bled into apathy. Either she had somehow broke Jashin's gift, entirely possible and horrifying to consider, or there was something that she was just missing and she'd get it sooner or later. Maybe Jashin wasn't showing her visions of her looming Akatsuki problem because she was competent enough to handle it. Maybe she didn't need any edge on Orochimaru. Maybe mysterious worrying Crowman was just far more important than any of her immediate problems and sooner or later, she'd see the truth of it. Sakura was already out of bed, shrugging on shoes and a jacket before she remembered that she wasn't at the Enclave, and that there wasn't a small kitchenette with hot water and tea leaves waiting for her to help her calm down after a hectic night's sleep. She hesitated in the middle of the living room. She could always go to the kitchen. She remembered the way from where Karen had shown her earlier. She'd been told she was a guest. Surely Orochimaru wouldn't begrudge her a late-night cup of tea? Strike that, he definitely would. He would definitely milk whatever he could out of her for a drop of tea, and she was stupid to think otherwise. But damn it all, she needed a hot drink. Gaara, can I borrow Emi? Gaara was up, of course. He did get sleep, contrary to his earlier claims, but it was usually light and complemented by one or more Tanuki taking watch whenever his eyes shut. He had elected to ignore a bedroom in favor of the living room, from which he could keep an eye on herself and Sai simultaneously. Sakura saw green eyes peer at her in the dark as she spoke. I could go with you. And freak out Sai if he wakes up with both of us gone? I don't think so. Sakura, we are in Orochimaru's house. And he's an inquisitive bitch who won't kill me until he gets information out of me. If something happens, I'll send Emi your way and you can kick his ass yourself. Kabuto. Let him try me, if Naruto could pummel him, I probably won't do half bad. Sasuke. Okay, maybe he'd have the gall to challenge me to a midnight tussle when we're supposed to be resting for the Akatsuki fight, but it might be a little fun to be the one denying him for once. Sakura could have sworn she saw Gaara's eyes roll in the dark. You know I don't like you going off into dangerous areas alone. Alright, he had her there. It was technically true that every time she'd gone off on her own, something bad had happened. Itake. That weird Uchiha that might possibly be Kakashi's old teammate. That time she'd taken a wrong turn in the Enclave and had walked in on two Hagashusei doing really inappropriate things with knives. Sakura shuddered. You might have a point. I do have a point. I guess Akatsuki could attack at any moment. But you get to go wake Sai and tell him he has to come with us for a 5-minute tea run. Sakura could feel Gaara shuddering. Sai didn't wake up easy. Sai woke up wielding all sorts of pointy things and occasionally some very creative curse words that Sakura knew he definitely didn't learn from Root. 10 minutes later, after Gaara had finished picking shuriken out of his sand armor, they arrived at the kitchen. It was dark and almost unnaturally quiet, but at this point Sakura just wanted her drink and no eerie kitchen atmosphere was going to dissuade her. It was admittedly a bit strange that Orochimaru's inner sanctum ran on candlelight and not electric lights, something her sleepy brain lingered on far too long as she took a match to the nearby holders. The boys waited outside the door as she rummaged through cabinets for a cup and something flavorful to put in water. There were several unlabeled bags of herbs that Sakura wouldn't dare touch with a 10-foot pole, but in the back of one cabinet there were some tucked-away bags of a brand that was, surprisingly, from Konoha of all places. Sentiment, Sakura wondered? Maybe Sasuke had asked for some tastes of home. Sakura even found herself lingering on thoughts of home as she brought water to a boil. She wasn't necessarily uncomfortable being stuck in a dark underground hole for a few days. The Enclave was plenty dark, and she found an odd sort of comfort in cave-like spaces now. But she did miss trees. Whenever her group finally settled down, whenever the ambassadors decided on a home, it needed to have trees. The tea finished steeping, and as she picked up the kettle, a cup appeared in front of her, thrust her way by a pale hand. If you don't mind. What Sakura would have liked to have done was smoothly pour the man a cup of tea and play it off like she'd heard him approaching the whole time. And where had Gaara and Sai been that they hadn't heard Orochimaru come into the room? What Sakura did instead was let a very undignified squeak while deftly juggling a kettle in one hand and a quickly drawn kunao in the other. Orochimaru in turn raised an eyebrow and continued to hold out a cup. There was a brief moment of pause in which Sakura's sleeping brain tried to catch up with her now very awake body. She hit a strange half-awake medium that accepted the situation as it was and did what a polite guest would do and poured the man some tea. In the corner of her eye she saw an open door in the kitchen, one that had looked very much like a blank wall before but now was very obviously a secret door of sort. There was a certain kind of humor to be found in knowing that Orochimaru had gotten a secret passage made to the kitchen instead of just walking there like a normal human being. She certainly couldn't help but wonder what Orochimaru was doing up at 3 in the morning. It was entirely possible that Orochimaru just didn't sleep. Tsunade had mentioned, now that she thought about it, that her old teammate had been prone to bursts of insomnia while he was still in the village, sometimes even coming to her for sleep aids or even just a midnight chat. Tsunade had grown uncharacteristically nostalgic talking about those times. Another poignant reminder that, once upon a time, Orochimaru hadn't been the maniac who'd killed the third Hokage or gotten kicked out of the village for child experimentation. Once upon a time, people had cared about him. That he had fallen away from that for something as silly as immortality would never make sense to Sakura, ever. She couldn't picture an eternal life without her boys in it. She couldn't picture an eternal life taken from the lives of others either. She sighed and poured herself her own cup of tea. Even with these surprising displays of domesticity, Orochimaru was still Orochimaru. Maybe even showing such displays to let her guard down. Still, this was a rare opportunity to chat with him pseudo alone. Maybe she was only halfway awake at this time of night, but maybe it was the same for him. Maybe she could get something through to him that she wouldn't be able to otherwise. Or maybe he'd just ask her to tell him about the Sharingan again. She caught sight of sand wisping around her as she turned to face the Otokage again. Gaara had clearly noticed who was in the room, but thankfully had the tact not to immediately try to break whatever tentative peace was there. It was a comfort, though, and what she needed to try yet again to talk with one of the most terrifying men she'd ever met. Have tea at 3 in the morning often? Sakura almost squeaked again as Orochimaru was the one to break the silence. He was leaning against the wall now, keeping an insufferable smirk on his face as he did so. The bastard knew exactly how uncomfortable he made her, and Sakura was not going to let him get to her. Could ask the same of you. Research never sleeps. Orochimaru answered in turn. Even when the body stops, the mind continues into the far hours of the night, seeking answers to questions that refuse to remain dormant. It was, weirdly relevant to her current situation. Awake in the wee hours yet again because a stupid dream wouldn't stop nagging her. Well, Tsunade had told her to try and intrigue the man. She'd hit a dead end with this dream. Sometimes one had to look at unconventional sources for unconventional answers. I've been working on a history project. Sakura began, choosing her phrasing carefully as she sat down at the kitchen table. An old letter of sorts. I've been trying to figure out who wrote it, but so far I don't have very many clues. It's esoteric and infuriating. Oh. Orochimaru's tone turned curious, and Sakura knew she had him. Hook, line, and sinker. History is truly a fascinating mystery, isn't it? In the realm of the past lie gods and myths. And monsters. Sakura answered in turn. Even now, with hot tea in her hands and her senses more about her, she could still feel the fear creeping up on the back of her neck as whatever avatar of hatred existed in that vision approached. There are those who think shinobi monsters. Speaking from experience, I take it. Unlike others, I take pride in the name. There was something a bit surreal in how Orochimaru spoke to her. Even with her title as ambassador, all of the other cages still spoke to her in a manner that insisted that she was still young, still inexperienced, still somewhat beneath them. Orochimaru, he lacked that sort of inflection. It hit her, all at once, why it had been so easy for him to draw Sasuke in. Treat everyone like an equal, like you respected them, like you believed in them. Orochimaru did it in a sinister manner, but in a way, she could learn from it. Having that sort of respect for everyone she met was something she'd need as an ambassador. It still didn't stop her from jumping somewhat as Orochimaru quietly slunk into the chair next to her. I take it you're researching a monster. Not surprisingly, considering your company. Yeah, Sai can be a bit of a monster in the morning if you wake him up wrong. Sakura smoothly retorted. She wasn't going to let Orochimaru drag Gaara through the mud on her watch. Instead, she simply pulled out a small scroll at her hip, one of the few she'd always slept with, as complete of a transcript as she'd managed to get of her dream sequence. She rolled it across the table to Orochimaru, watching out of the corner of her eye as he opened it and took a look. I'll admit this is somewhat more interesting than you'd made it out to be. Very few have the knowledge to speak of Kaguya. So Orochimaru thought the speaker was referring to Kaguya as well. Sakura could almost hear Sai's smug smirk from the other side of the door. You didn't think it strange that I knew about her before? I wouldn't have expected another to be researching her. I could inquire as to your source of this transcription. An eye for an eye, Lord Orochimaru. Orochimaru grinned. Oh, I hardly think signing a binding international treatise is worth that information. No, Sakura agreed. But I'll still let you make other offers. Fair trade, of course. But I know so little about what a young lady like yourself might want. Hard to have time for wants when there's so much to do. Oh, come now. You can't tell me you don't have any personal ambitions. And I told you before, my ambition is the project. Such a clever little liar. Even to yourself. Orochimaru carefully rolled up her scroll before sending it back over the table to her. The greatest lie of the shinobi world is that the duties of the world are more important than the dreams of the individual. So the world should suffer for one to thrive. Not at all. Orochimaru countered. Merely that a country that tampers down the needs of its citizens is doomed to tear itself apart. But a country that ignores its own duties will fall apart anyway. Balance then, don't you think? Orochimaru raised up his cup, and in a rather stunning feat of dexterity, and perhaps chakra control, balanced the cup on a single finger. I should think one that tends to involve themselves in the governing of the shinobi world would not neglect the individuals that make it up. That is how Jinhuriki grow up outcasts. That is how the Uchiha are drawn into rebellion. How you were drawn into child murder. Sakura could have kicked herself for the quip, but Orochimaru merely seemed amused. I gave them a chance to seek greatness. It isn't fault of mine that only one of them survived it. Still a bastard. And Sakura didn't want to talk in circles forever. She wasn't going to change the man. If Tsunade couldn't, if Jiraiya couldn't, then it plain wasn't possible. But she could still try to get something out of this. All right. She decided. Information for information. That's fair, isn't it? Naturally. You're seeking immortality. A perfect body. The power of Kaguya. So tell me, after you've gotten all of that, then what? Orochimaru was quiet for a good long while. Enough for Sakura to finish off the last of her tea and stand up to clean the kettle she'd used to make it. The silence lasted until Sakura was ready to head back to her room once again. You know, Haruno, I actually have no idea. Sakura smiled. She didn't mean to, not really, but something about finding a question that stumped even the snake himself just brought a weird warmth into her heart. Enough so that by the time she returned to bed, she'd mostly forgotten about the dream. Warmth didn't last forever, of course. It was supposed to go like this: Karen would play border watch, using her unnaturally effective sensing skills to determine when Akatsuki were about to cross into the city borders. Deidara's techniques were primarily earth-based, which meant that Sasuke's lightning would be a perfect counter for any bomb dropped in the area, so long as he was fast enough. Sai, already practiced as a ranged fighter, would provide eyes in the sky on Deidara's location and actions. Karen would provide support, in both healing and crowd control, directing citizens away from Deidara's bombs and making sure that nobody got caught in the ensuing scuffle. Sakura and Gaara would stick together alongside Jugo, a powerful close-ranged fighter who was, as it turned out, the origin of Orochimaru's popular curse mark. He could transform himself with nature energy, of all things, but instead of becoming a statue like most, the transformations ended up being somewhat protective in nature. His skin hardened, his strength grew, and all of these things would be a perfect foil to someone like Sasori who dealt in long-ranged puppetry and poisons. If Sasori could penetrate Jugo's armor at all, the high concentration of nature energy would help cycle the poison out, and whatever he couldn't cure, Sakura could heal. She'd play long-range support with her earth jutsu, while Gaara kept up defensive barriers for all of them. A solid team, one that Karen seemed to trust implicitly, which gave Sakura some hope as well. With Kabuto keeping Orochimaru out of the way and Karen hurting civilians, it would just be them and the fight. Of course, if Sakura knew anything by now, things never went as planned. The alarm came early in the morning, about an hour after Sakura usually got up to do her morning exercise. Karen came running to the door, knocking on it rapidly until Sakura could wrench it open. They're here. Get to the south training ring like we planned. I'll make sure Jugo meets up with you there before the bombs start falling. Sai, you're with me. Take Emi with you. Gaara insisted, practically plopping the tanuki into Sai's arms. Anything goes wrong, you send her to us, we'll find a way to get to you. Focus on staying alive, perhaps. Sai countered. I'm with the Uchiha. He's too stubborn to let anyone hurt me but him. Ain't that a truth? Karen rolled her eyes before taking Sai by the arm and leading him away. South Ring, get going. It was simple enough. Sakura quickly threw on her armor and summoned Kazei Yari from its containment so that she could let it sling comfortably against her back. Gaara stretched as she prepared, falling into stances that Shukaku had gone over with him time and time again. They were ready, Sakura thought to herself. Ready as they would ever be to face a shinobi terror. Then someone knocked on their door again. Sakura opened the door to see Kabuto's pleasantly smiling face. Sakura. Orochimaru wants to speak with you, if you don't mind. And only you. He seemed rather insistent that it be private. Sakura glanced over to Gaara, and she was absolutely certain that the same word passed through his head as did hers. Fuck. Kabuto was supposed to be keeping Orochimaru out of the way, wasn't he? And surely, if he was a spy for Sasori, he'd be aware that Sasori would be here within the compound any minute. And that Sasori asked for him to keep Orochimaru away? Something was up. Something had changed. They'd missed a meeting, some change of plans, and now Karen was too far away to get a message to without arousing some sort of suspicion in Kabuto. For now, all they could do was play ignorant to the situation and go along with meeting Orochimaru while Akatsuki was literally at their front door. Sure. Sakura said with her best possible imitation of Sai's fake smile. Lead the way. She paused only to glance back at Gaara, knowing that he'd probably know exactly what she expected of him, follow at a distance, and don't be seen. The truth of the matter occurred to her a couple minutes into their walk. Kabuto wasn't leading her to Orochimaru, but rather leading her to a location where she'd be away from Gaara and unable to protect him. Sakura was willing to bet that whatever room Kabuto put her in would end up being empty and quickly locked the moment she was in it. It would work out, with Gaara tailing them. He'd simply free her once Kabuto had run off, and they'd still rendezvous with Jugo, albeit a little later than intended. So long as they could avoid running into Sasori on the way, their plan could still work. Of course, that plan backfired when Kabuto opened the door to a large room and Orochimaru was actually in it. But in Sakura's defense, Kabuto seemed surprised about it too. Lord Orochimaru dash. Kabuto. Orochimaru answered with trademark grin. This one, however, wasn't the smug, egotistical grin that Sakura was used to. This one was murderous. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? Had Orochimaru not known? Karen had seemed to think Orochimaru was aware of Kabuto's double agent status, perhaps even believing that Kabuto was truly spying on Sasori for him. But Kabuto hadn't told Orochimaru about Sasori and Deidara's coming assault, per Sasori's orders, which meant that, in Orochimaru's eyes, Kabuto was really Sasori's man through and through. Karen had spoken of her plan to become Otokage in the coming years. An important part of that plan was ridding Orochimaru of Kabuto, since Kabuto was instrumental in keeping Orochimaru's body healthy after the grueling soul transfer process. Without a trained medic, Orochimaru would be at a disadvantage. Nobody else in Oto had Kabuto's skill, and Kabuto had intended it that way, lest Orochimaru think to replace him. It was in that brief moment that Sakura got an idea. Lord Orochimaru, I really don't know what your dash. Don't lie to him. Sakura spoke up, catching both their attention at once. You know you can't keep that kind of secret from him forever. I will say, though, I'd really thought you'd be smart enough not to stab Orochimaru in the back. How dare you even think dash? She's right, Kabuto. Orochimaru answered in turn. I gave you chance after chance. I took pity on you after I learned what Sasori had done to your mind to keep you loyal to him. I removed the seal he'd placed on you and still accepted you as my own. And yet you let him into my domain without a single word to me. You said you didn't care what happened to the Jinhuriki. And I also said I wanted Harano alive. Not shipped off to Pain for him to do Sage knows what to her. Well, that had implications Sakura didn't want to think about. Kabuto hadn't just been planning to lock her in here, he'd been planning to ship her off to Akatsuki. She wasn't surprised Pain wanted to get his hands on her, Haiden had warned her of that weeks ago. She was surprised that Sasori would have entrusted Kabuto with the task, of all people. Sasori thought Kabuto his. Orochimaru thought Kabuto his. Kabuto played both sides. No matter who came out on top, Akatsuki or Orochimaru, Kabuto won. High risk, safe reward. She didn't have time to think about why Orochimaru wanted her alive specifically. She had a chance right now, a chance to turn this scenario around and help Karen in the long run. You know, you're the Snake Master, Lord Orochimaru, but I think this one's gotten a bit too big for his britches. Sakura folded her arms, making a show of looking disdainful. He's stupid to cross you, and he's stupid to think he would have stood a chance of wrapping me up for Pain anyway. Kabuto sputtered, but stopped as he felt a presence crawling up behind them. Gaara's energy was impossible to ignore when he was riled, especially when in perfect sync with Shukaku. Should have made sure we stayed behind, you four-eyed cretin. Sakura winced at Shukaku's taunt. Didn't the Baijuyu have anything better than a glasses insult? It was still enough to send Kabuto stumbling back, however, while Gaara took his place at Sakura's side. The man looked back and forth between them and Orochimaru. Listen, Orochimaru, It's really not what you think, she's playing you for a fool. That's a weak excuse, Kabuto. You'll have to do better than that. You need me? He doesn't. Sakura countered. A lie, but one she could work with. Lady Tsunade implemented a shared medical program with all allied shinobi nations. She'll share her medical knowledge with anyone who signs on, and she's far more knowledgeable than you. Anything you did for Orochimaru can be taught to someone else, even better than you'd ever managed. She was the one Orochimaru went to in order to get a fix for his arms, wasn't she? Nothing you knew could help him with that. She saw Kabuto pale at that, and admittedly felt the tiniest little bit of vindication in knowing she'd probably just made Kabuto wet himself. What an amusing point our little Harino makes. Orochimaru chuckled. One I had been considering since I read her adorable little treaty. Why, if I sign on, my dear friend Tsunade won't have a choice but to share her knowledge with me. Perhaps even ways to circumvent a host's rejection. I'd planned on letting you do the honors, but it seems you've chosen your side today. Wait, he'd been considering signing even without the information on the Sherry Non. That fucking snake had been trying to weasel shit out of her. Focus. She had to focus. She was turning Orochimaru against Kabuto, she was making it so he had to sign her treaty, and she was setting Karen up for an easier takedown in the immediate future, and Kabuto was attempting to run out the door. Sakura didn't stop him. It wasn't her place, and the weasel deserved a bit of fear after playing the double agent game for so long without consequence. It was Orochimaru that worried her now. Kabuto wouldn't be keeping him out of the way, so what would he do with Sasori and Deidara about to try and hunt down a Jinchuriki within his borders? Foolish. Orochimaru muttered. Like I said, stupid. Sakura agreed. Nogara replied quietly. That's not what he means. Sasori's right outside. And he was about to figure out that Kabuto had failed in separating Gaara from his companions and in keeping Orochimaru out of his business. Haiden had mentioned one important thing about Sasori, he didn't tolerate failure. They had moments, it seemed, before their fated fight with Sasori was to begin. There was no Jugo, even if Gaara had sent out a Tanuki before coming in, it would take a while for the summon to bring Jugo back. On top of that, Orochimaru was there, and while he seemed to want Sakura alive for the moment, he'd been very blunt about not caring what happened to Gaara. But in the grand scheme of things, and Sakura couldn't believe she was thinking it, she'd take her chances with the snake. She backed away from the door, Gaara keeping close to her, until she was standing at Orochimaru's side. You know, she spoke, a little bird told me that apparently Akatsuki has some sort of leverage to keep you out of their affairs. Have I mentioned you have some extremely curious little birds? You've as good as admitted to me that you'd be interested in signing the treaty for Tsunade's medical knowledge. But I know you want information on fighting the Sherry Non. So let me turn the deal around. It was a gamble. It was the biggest, stupidest gamble she'd made in a while, but as she'd learned early on, sometimes stupid gambles had the biggest payoffs. Deidara and Sasori are here to collect Gaara. Help me take Sasori down and I'll tell you everything I know. About the Sherry Non, what I know about Kaguya, everything. You have my word. Orochimaru grinned again, and this time it was the smug grin she'd come to expect from the snake. You have a deal, Miss Harino. But I expect everything. Chapter 74. It wasn't that Deidara wanted to be here. He would have rather not have been bullied into joining Akatsuki at all. But if he was going to be stuck in Otagaku or providing distraction for his grump of a teammate, at the very least he could turn the situation to his advantage. Getting a fight with Sasuke Uchiha? A perfect way to test whether or not he was any closer to standing a chance against his shit stain of a brother. Of course, he wasn't sure if the Uchiha was going to come for him or go protect the Jinchuriki, but Sasori's little spy had seemed convinced enough that Uchiha was under some other girl's thumb, and that she'd prioritize protecting the village, so if he dropped enough bombs. Deidara didn't like relying on spies, but the chance of fighting the Uchiha was better than just spritzing the ground with a few pretty booms and not having much more to do with himself. He reached up to adjust his eyepiece, scanning the village's streets for any sign of dark and brooding. The village was not quite as peaceful as he was expecting. Everyone seemed to be rapidly moving in one of three directions, towards steel warehouses that Went underground, son of a bitch. They were evacuating, before he'd even had a chance to show them his art. This was why he didn't like relying on spies. Someone must have heard Big Bad Akatsuki was on its way and started evacuation protocols. Either that, or they had a hell of a censor in their ranks. Or maybe the Uchiha had. Deidara shook his head. Fuck the Uchiha. It was Sasori's fault that his spy had let something slip, and just because there weren't any civilians loitering about didn't mean he still couldn't have a good time. If anything, it was the perfect grounds to test some of his newest creations. You better keep the snake and that Jinhiriki busy, Sasori. Manipulating his chakra-infused clay came easily to him, a comforting feeling as he molded wings and sharp beaks onto his creations. He'd start off small, see whose attention he caught with a little line of C1. The birds flew forth from his hands, directed towards one of the steel warehouses that was currently being used as an evac point. Unfortunately for whomever was in charge down there, he liked to play dirty. There was a moment of silence, anticipation building, before the birds detonated against the doors of the warehouse. The metal held, but earth and stone were kicked up from below, along with the bodies of those who'd had a front-line view to his creations. Deidara grinned. Having caught a taste of battle, he urged his clay mount to fly within the city boundaries. If he could nail all 3 evacuation points, the chaos would certainly make it difficult for his opponents to launch a counter-strike. He readied another barrage of birds, forcing his mount to position itself so that he could see his next target. The birds flew true, speeding towards the doors, and then they were suddenly beheaded, and instead of exploding from the impact, they fell to the ground, twitching from sparks. And there that bastard was, wielding a sword infused with lightning chakra and managing to stare him down even from a distance. Deidara would have recognized Sasuke Uchiha on sight alone, never mind the fact that his Sharingan blazed his way even from a distance. It was eerie how similar to his brother he looked. The same eyes, the same arrogant eyes. Lightning chakra was more than capable of disabling his creations, which meant he needed to be smart. Sasori's spy had claimed the Uchiha was best at close range, and that gave Deidara an advantage. If he used a few of his creations to keep Uchiha occupied, while sneaking in some others at a distance that no shinobi could hope to reach quick enough, he could still cause some havoc. Maybe even get a really big boom, if he kept Uchiha where he was. Easy enough. There wasn't any way that one shinobi could cover a whole village, and unless they had multiple skilled lightning release users, Deidara still held an advantage. He prepared more birds to keep the Uchiha at bay, using his other hand to prepare something a bit larger. He'd let the Uchiha dance around protecting civilians while his art redecorated Oto into something a bit more his taste. His birds shot off into the distance, while he simultaneously let a larger one trail in the direction of the final evacuation point. Uchiha went for the smaller ones, of course, and the larger. Something flew through the air, grappling with his creation and dragging it upwards, away from the city. His creation scrapped with the dark creature, until the latter put enough pressure upon it to make it explode, far above the city and too high to hit anything. Had it been a bird? And where had it come from? Movement in the corner of his eye caught his attention, and Deidara saw more of the black and white birds flying in his direction. He maneuvered his mount to dodge, watching as the final bird seemed to hit the butt of his mount with a two-wet splat. Ink? They're ink creations? Now this was interesting. Deidara wasn't partial to ink outside of its use in making paper bombs, but he'd never seen this particular application before. The ink given solid form, able to grapple with his own creations, yet still lacking that final touch. Of course, what use was the creation if it didn't have that final little spark? Why, if he was making these, he would have integrated explosion seals into the ink design and make it so that more ink birds appeared, and this time Deidara could see that they were carrying small paper bombs within their claws. Alright, not how he would have done it, but whomever this fighter was had the start of something. Deidara grinned as he called forth a handful of clay spiders, throwing them into the air to intercept his opponent's birds. The sky lit up, like fireworks, a strangely beautiful harmony of colored ink and flame. Alright, little artist. You've got my attention. No doubt the fighter would keep sending birds his way in an attempt to distract him from laying waste to the city. Another ranged fighter, like himself, and Deidara obviously couldn't waste time scanning about for him. He had to find out where the birds were coming from fast, or else this would turn his advantage away. Plus, there was the Uchiha down below. Damn the Uchiha and damn the Akatsuki for wasting my time. He could be testing the fruit of this artist's labor, engaging in explosive discussion across the landscape, witnessing the harmony of ink and clay, and, wait a minute, had that bastard Uchiha sprouted wings? By the look of things, this was about to change from a long-ranged fight to a close-ranged brawl, and he still hadn't seen where his artistic opponent was coming from. On top of that, wasn't he supposed to be taking care of the Harano girl? He hadn't seen any glimpse of a pink-haired shinobi, and unless she was the artist, that meant Sasori hadn't succeeded in separating her from the Ichibai. Unless she was lying low while the others fought for her, but Haiden hadn't given him the impression that Harano was a coward. Deidara let his mount soar straight across the village now, absent-mindedly chucking bombs just to keep the Uchiha delayed. He could use his C2 to pepper the landscape with mines, that could keep Uchiha busy long enough to find the other artist. Those wings didn't let him go very high, by the look of things, and that sort of mutation had to be fairly chakra-intensive. Let him exhaust himself being a ballsy idiot. There was a more important fighter to seek out now, and maybe Deidara wanted to be here after all. Sasuke, come in. He's heading for the eastern evac point, you need to intercept him before he takes another route out. Over. HN. Use your damn words when you're speaking over comms. Over. HN. Over. By the look of things, he's a bit too occupied to provide much thought into answering your questions, Spitfire. He's only capable of having one thought at a time. Over. Sai, I swear on the sage, if you rile him up in the middle of a goddamn fight with Akatsuki, I will personally pull your spine out through your teeth. Over. Sai smirked, the violent banter more than a familiar comfort after having spent so long under the Hagashisai. Admittedly, he had the least amount of heat on him at the moment. Deidara hadn't realized yet that Sai was soaring above him rather than sending his attacks from the ground, and since Deidara's focus was bombing the city, that kept him the safest of the group. He could keep an eye on where Deidara was headed, provide visuals on the types of bombs he was preparing, and if Sasuke couldn't reach a bomb in time, Sai could provide backup. Karin was busy with the evacuation, but once that was done, she'd be able to give ground support as well. They'd focus on getting Deidara out of the sky and then taking him out of commission, non-lethally, which he was surprised Karin and Sasuke had agreed on, but after considering that Sasuke's sole focus in life was getting strong enough to beat his traitor brother, Sai could see why getting information on Itaka would be a top priority. Worked out for him either way. He adjusted his headpiece to get a closer look at Deidara, noting with an amused chuckle that Deidara also seemed to have a similar-looking headpiece. Had they shopped at the same store in Grass? It hadn't escaped his notice that they both used art as a weapon, though Deidara had definitely focused on destructive power instead of utility. Sai doubted he could use his clay creations to deliver messages or spy on the enemy. Plus, and maybe this was his ego talking, but his ink creations looked prettier. He let his hand flow across his scroll, easily creating a horde of birds to counteract some of Deidara's. His mind wandered to Sakura, who was theoretically working on Sasori now with Gaara and Jugo. He'd questioned why Karin hadn't given them a headset, and she'd informed him that hers were incapable of reaching into Orochimaru's lair on purpose. Orochimaru hadn't wanted anyone to be able to listen in on his conversations below, should the technology leak out. If they took Deidara out quickly, however, they could meet up with Sakura and provide assistance. But he'd been told to wait to fully engage until evacuation was complete. So for now, he waited and watched. Sakura readied her mind, falling into a defensive stance at the same time Gaara assumed a familiar position to her left. Orochimaru, in contrast, did not move at all. There was something to be said about the confidence to not assume a fighting stance prior to a duel, and Sakura wondered briefly if Orochimaru really was planning on fighting alongside them, or if he planned on stepping back at the last minute. He wants the information on the Sharingan, Sakura reminded herself. He won't let you die before he gets it. That knowledge alone was the only reassurance she had when Sasori of the Red Sand stepped into the room. She'd seen the puppet through Haiden's eye, but that still wasn't enough to stop a shiver from running through her as it stalked forward, oozing killing intent despite the inhuman stillness of the face. Hirako, the puppet was called. Temari had wrestled information from Sasori's grandmother, of all people, and had sent over the original designs of the puppet for Sakura's perusal. It had likely changed since Lady Cho had seen it last, but at the very least Sakura knew what to expect: a lethal snake-like tail, traps within the arms and mouth, and Sasori himself buried within, using the puppet's carapace as a shield. They'd have to break the puppet to have a chance at taking down Sasori, and even then, he was a puppet master, and Hirako definitely wouldn't be the only one in his arsenal. And of course, just one hit from any of his weapons could be a hit with lethal poisons. Orochimaru. The puppet spoke, its voice deep and modulated. I figured you wouldn't have an attachment to these children. Once again, Sasori, you've failed to comprehend my motivations. Orochimaru quipped back in turn, running his long tongue across his lips. Why would I pass up a chance to make up for that disastrous affair 5 years ago? Our fight didn't quite finish the way either of us liked, did it? You'd move against Akatsuki to settle a grudge. What makes you think you'll live to tell them I did? They sounded like two old men bickering about a game. Maybe it would have seemed threatening to anyone else, but Sakura had been listening to the Hagashusei threat talk each other for months now. She'd gotten the impression that the two weren't fond of each other, and yet wasted time on banter, rivals, perhaps. It almost reminded her of how Naruto and Sasuke used to sound egging each other on. Can we save the bickering for later? Sakura finally asked. I'd like to settle this quickly, before Deidara causes too much of a mess upstairs. Hirako's face turned to meet her own. Respectable. Sasori answered. You are no doubt Sakura Harano, and the Ichibai with you. His name is Gaara. The Ichibai is Shukaku. His name will not matter. And soon, neither will yours. Hirako's mouth opened, and out came a flurry of senbon. Gaara's sand provided a quick barrier, curling a wall of sand in front of Sakura and Orochimaru both. Not strong enough to pierce his barrier, thankfully, but they couldn't keep behind a wall forever. Sakura let her fists fall to the ground and used her chakra to pull the earth around them to form her gauntlets. Unless you have a better idea, Orochimaru, I would appreciate some backup. If you keep the tail occupied, I can go for the body. Gaara will keep the traps off our back. Hirako, broken apart by a little girl. How delightfully humiliating. Orochimaru answered. He'll never be able to live it down, even in death. It was as good a confirmation as she was going to get. They'd counted on Jugo being their front-line assault, but without him, well, she certainly wasn't going to order Orochimaru to take front while she played supported. The bastard would never allow himself in such a position. That meant her switching roles, and that was dangerous. But I never intended to play support for the rest of my life, did I? Sakura pushed chakra to her legs and launched herself forward, through Gaara's sand which molded around her like a second layer of armor. As more needles flew towards her, the sand shifted and moved to deflect it. Out of the corner of her eye she saw Orochimaru matching her in speed, dodging the needles so quickly that Gaara's sand seemed unnecessary. Dodge left. She heard Orochimaru speak, and she pushed herself over just as Hirako launched what appeared to be its left arm towards them. A bomb, that was Sakura's first thought, and while it did burst, it unleashed another barrage of needles rather than flame or poison smoke. The arm hadn't been in Cho's blueprints for the puppet, but Orochimaru's warning had allowed Gaara to prepare a wall for each of them to deflect what they couldn't avoid. Sakura paused only long enough to catch her breath. Even Sasori seemed to realize that his needles had reached their limit, and as she began her run again, it was the tail this time that unwound to challenge her. It sprung like a snake, sharp tail reaching for her chest, but was stopped by Orochimaru's tongue wrapping around one of the joints and yanking it out of her way. It left the perfect opening, and Sakura was more than ready to put on a final burst of speed. She propelled herself into the air, letting the arc of her jump carry her so that her gauntlet slammed down upon Hirako's back just as the jump ended. She felt the wood crack and shatter. The tail flopped uselessly onto the ground, and the puppet became lifeless as something jumped out from within it. Sakura grinned. One puppet down, and now Sasori would be exposed and vulnerable. Her grin faltered when Sasori turned to face them for the first time. Admirable teamwork. If I didn't know better, I would assume you had been planning to defeat me like this, Orochimaru. His face was young. Too young, far too young for the near 40-year-old man that had been described to her by Suna. Sasori looked as though he could pass for her age. Something about this wasn't right. Sakura let her senses expand to touch against Sasori's chakra. There was still a network, but it seemed to run along the outside of the body, rather than within it, and it all centered at a single point at his chest, a single point that held vastly more chakra than any one body part could hold naturally. What have you done to yourself? Sakura found herself asking. Your chakra dash. Do not dwell upon it, Harano. He has simply found his own path to immortality. Orochimaru answered for Sasori. Transforming himself into one of the puppets he so admired, never aging, never facing hunger or thirst, incredibly tempting, if I had any desire to leave biology behind. This is the difference between us. Sasori replied in turn. You cling to your outdated form, while I shall remain eternal. You've bastardized yourself. Sakura heard Shukaku speak through Gaara, and only in their early days of interaction had she ever heard such disgust in the Byakuya's voice. Throwing aside your humanity for such a stupid ideal. A true puppet master would be revolted by the very idea. Sakura couldn't help but agree, but Orochimaru was right. There was no point in dwelling on what Sasori had done now, not when they were in the middle of battle. That single point of chakra, that was what she had to focus upon. We need to aim for the matrix above his heart. He must be controlling the body from there. If not, disabling such a high source of chakra should still be detrimental. Sensing abilities too? How very interesting. I expect to hear about this too, when you tell me everything. Typical of the man, already thinking about what he'd gain in the future rather than the fight right now. Sakura backed off, closer to Gaara. It might have been strategic to try and jump Sasori now, but it was also risky. If Sasori's true form was also a puppet, it was likely trapped equally as much as Hirako had been, and she knew nothing about it. Orochimaru possibly knew, which meant following his lead. But Sasori, it seemed, didn't plan on using himself to start. He pulled out a large scroll, unraveling it in front of him. I will admit, the last time I used this against you, Orochimaru, you provided yourself with an adequate counter. However, I doubt you will have the same counter again, and I have only improved my strategy since. With a puff of smoke, Sasori's strategy revealed itself. It was an admittedly menacing-looking puppet at first glance, with piercing eyes and a black shroud that seemed to move as if it had a mind of its own. Sakura thought through her notes, trying to remember any of the puppets Cho had mentioned, but this didn't seem like any of them. It wasn't until Gaara spoke that it began to come together. I've seen pictures of that man before. That's the third Kazekage. Correct. Sasori answered. His techniques were crafted based on his observances of the previous Tsunagaku or Jinhiraki. Simple poison traps may not be able to penetrate your armor, but the Kazekage's technique should provide a more than suitable counter. And since your resurrection technique failed upon using it last, Orochimaru. Yes, I doubt I'll be able to pull out his soul to counter you again. Orochimaru answered. Thankfully, having a Jinhiraki on my side should suffice. Even you should have considered that. Naturally. That is why I won't be fighting with him alone. There was another puff of smoke, and Sakura heard a click come from Sasori's body. Around him, a dozen more red-robed puppets had appeared, each looking like their own unique fighter. An army. The bastard had brought an army. She'd expected as much, but even Cho's prediction had been wrong. A human puppet master could theoretically, at most, control 10 puppets, one per finger. But Sasori was now operating on a different level. He was controlling as many puppets as he liked with whatever device he was using in his chest. If they destroyed one puppet, he could easily just summon another and continue the dance. It was essentially 13 against 3, and one of the 13, by the sound of things, seemed tailor-made to counter Gaara's defensive techniques. They had to take down Sasori himself, and fast. All without knowing what Sasori's puppet body could do. My brother would certainly be impressed. Gaara said, suddenly spitting onto his hand. I might have even been worried. But I know how to summon friends, too. Gaara's hands went through a series of seals before he thrust them down onto the ground. Sakura felt wind rush past her as summoning smoke filled their side of the room. When the smoke cleared, Sakura grinned. 12 large tanuki now stood by them, each armored and ready for battle. Now they were back to an even playing field. Chapter 75. It reminded Sakura somewhat of the recent Konoha civil war, though rather than attempting to mad dash through the skirmish, she was simply waiting, watching as blades clashed and claw and wood scraped together. It was somewhat mesmerizing at first. Sasori was an enemy, but even she couldn't help but be enraptured by the skill it took to wordlessly command an army with nothing but raw chakra control, which is what puppetry assuredly was. She'd been told she was in the top percentile of chakra control in Konoha, and she had no doubt Sasori also fell into a similar category, but this. So this was what it meant to be an S-ranked shinobi. Danzo, for all his stolen power, had never reached this height, had never reached the poise and elegance that came from mastery of one's own talents. This was what Sakura needed to become if she was truly to wrangle the shinobi nations together, and right now, it was what she needed to defeat. Even with all her training, she felt herself balk at the prospect. Gaara's sand was busy, defending not just her and Orochimaru, but each of the tanuki as well, countering the strange black sand that the third Kaze cage puppet was manipulating against them. It was easy for Gaara to defend her here, where she wasn't moving, but the instant she charged into battle, things would become that much more difficult for him. Perhaps even impossible. If she couldn't trust herself to dodge on her own merit, she shouldn't be trusting herself to charge at all. Having second thoughts, Harano. Orochimaru's voice seemed to snake into her ears. Perhaps you're feeling a bit outclassed. A switch seemed to flip then, and Sakura didn't know how Orochimaru knew just what to say to snap her mind back into focus, but she'd never been one to back down from challenging words, not since she and Ino had become academy rivals. You only wish. She answered in turn. Of course, she'd prepared for a moment like this, a moment where she'd have to defend herself and attack. She'd specifically asked to be prepared for this. She unhooked Kaze Yari from its sling and let it fall comfortably into her right hand. She saw Orochimaru eyeing it with interest, which only caused her to smirk in turn. You didn't think I spent the past few months sitting on my ass, did you? The weapon is certainly new. But against puppets, it'll suffice. Kaze Yari was a spear, first and foremost. It wasn't all it was, but in terms of an offensive weapon, she was told it was well suited for her body type, providing range where she hadn't had it before. The downside was, unlike most spears, it wasn't a light, dexterous weapon. The blade was short, and the body of the shaft closest to the blade was thicker than the rest of the weapon, making it unbalanced and top-heavy. Many might have considered the spear useless, unwieldy at best. It had certainly taken some time to learn the nuances. Spears were offensive weapons. Kaze Yari was no ordinary spear. You know the target. Aim for the heart. Orochimaru licked his lips before bringing his hands together, an unfamiliar hand sign. Just don't become a liability, Harano. I've been waiting a long time for this kill. Don't let me stop you if you see a chance. They moved, and Sakura let instincts take over as she ran into the fray. In an instant, it seemed that Sasori's attentions were turned on her and Orochimaru. The puppets abandoned their fights with the tanuki to charge her, only being stopped when the tanuki followed in pursuit. Orochimaru's hands seemed to fly through formation after formation, summoning fire, wind, lightning, all in rapid succession. She'd heard the claim that Orochimaru wanted to learn every jutsu in existence, and now the man was starting to prove that claim. But he was slow, much slower than he'd been back when they'd first seen him in the Forest of Death. It was possible that he was preserving energy for Sasori's fight, but equally possible he was just slowing. He needed to transfer bodies soon or else his current body would reject his soul outright, that Tsunade had insisted upon. That was why he had been so desperate for Sasuke before. He was running out of time. Was the toll of his jutsu already beginning to show? Sakura didn't have time to linger on it. A puppet had already approached her, swords swinging only to clash with the hardwood of her spear. She was no expert in Sojutsu yet, but the Hagashusai had given her a crash course on surviving duels, and it was more than sufficient at keeping the enemy blades at bay long enough for a tanuki to rescue her. It did not, however, stop the puppet's mouth from opening wide and attempting to fire another barrage of poisoned needles in her direction. But Sakura had sworn she wouldn't be a damsel in distress, wouldn't wait around for Gaara or Sai to protect her, and that was exactly what Kazayari was for. The front of the spear unfolded, revealing exactly why the weapon had been designed to be so top-heavy. It revealed linking panels that spiraled into a circular, shield-like shape around the shaft, interlocking into its new position just in time to intercept the attack sent her way. Kazayari, the aptly named Umbrella Spear, had two forms: offensive and defensive. The needles bounced off the hardwood, keeping her safe and allowing her to continue to move forward. She clicked the trigger beneath her thumb and the spear refolded again, resuming its offensive form as she lunged forward and pushed the sharp blade through the puppet's face, removing the head in the process. Maybe Sasori could control the body without a head, but there would be no more needles coming from it at least. What artistry that weapon is! She heard Sasori comment from the other side of the room. I look forward to adding it to my collection. Like hell you will. Sakura slammed the blade of her spear into the dirt, channeling her earthen chakra through the shaft. The spear had two forms programmed in, but there was a third one that she'd learned after a spark of an idea and a few pointers from Shukaku. Earth molded around the blade, sticking with the input of her chakra, until the spear had transformed into an earthen hammer. It was already top-heavy, and since finesse wasn't going to break these puppets apart, Sakura decided she'd try a bit of brute force instead. As the next puppet headed her way, she pushed chakra into her arms for some oomph and slammed the face of the hammer into it as hard as her body could allow. The wood shattered under the blow with a satisfying crunch. Definitely not what the spear was made for, but sometimes Sakura just really liked breaking things. The hammer was a bit heavy, though, so she let the earth fall from it as she reassessed the battlefield. She would have thought the puppet army thinned by now, but for every puppet they destroyed, Sasori would simply summon another. She was aware that Sasori was known for being a one-man army, but this was becoming brutal. Puppets didn't tire, but she would, and she knew that Nuki would, and maybe even Gaara's strength would dwindle if he faced up against a cage-level threat long enough. You wouldn't happen to have a bow locked up in that tricky little weapon of yours, would you? Orochimaru asked as he skidded to a halt next to her. Or perhaps a flamethrower? Unfortunately, our best long-range support is outside keeping your village safe. Sakura retorted. I do know the water bullet technique, as well as some improvised earth techniques. That is all? Such pitiful teaching. Oniki was always a brawler, but to neglect such basic training. Well, you could stand around bitching about it, or you could deal with this yourself. Why haven't you killed that bastard yet? I enjoy toying with my prey before going in for the kill. That's such bullshit right now and you know it. Sakura looked over at the man, and then she saw it. What the hell was wrong with the man's hands? Maybe she just hadn't seen it before, or maybe he'd been hiding it with genjutsu that was pointless to keep up now, but where there had been pale skin before, there was now purpled skin that looked more like rotted corpse than true flesh. That Orochimaru could move his hands despite this clearly severe injury was even more of a miraculous feat. That was when Sakura remembered what Tsunade had told her, about the nature of the injury left upon him by the third Hokage, that which not even body switching could truly heal. He severed the sole of his arms, Sakura. And healing a soul? That's an S-ranked medical technique that not even he has yet to master. Sakura couldn't even begin to consider what sort of vicious technique directly damaged one's soul, not to mention what sort of jutsu could heal one. Did Karen know of this weakness yet? It was surely one that Kabuto had been trying to treat, but with no Kabuto now. Orochimaru was truly at his weakest. At the verge of being rejected by his host body, his arms wounded by the third Hokage, now really was the proper time to try and take the old snake down. And that of course meant that Sasori had the best chance he'd ever get at killing Orochimaru here and now and turning the fight in his favor. Sakura unfurled Kazayari into its defensive form once again, intercepting a puppet that had launched several kunao in their direction. Your arms. She said aloud. You're not able to use jutsu as effectively with your injury. You're only able to move them at all because you're living on top of a borrowed soul. Astute observation, though I suppose Tsunade informed you of this. You bastard, you knew you couldn't take Sasori on your own with that injury. You're counting on me to incapacitate him for you. Just as you were counting on me to do the same. Don't play hypocrite, Harino, it doesn't suit you. Fine. Keep the puppets off my back, if you can manage that. She was supposed to be respectful to Cage, but right now she was soured on the fact that she might not be as safe in this fight as she thought. She was supposed to have Jugo to tank Sasori's hits. She wasn't supposed to be the one taking Sasori head on. She was supposed to be providing backup to a better close-ranged fighter. Fuck it. I need you to launch me. Orochimaru glanced at her, clearly baffled. Launch you. Use wind jutsu. Something to send me across the battlefield as quickly as possible. We need somebody to start occupying Sasori, and I'm not going to get close if he keeps summoning more puppets to distract us. So play support and get me to Sasori, and I'll figure out how to finish him from there. At the very least keep him from summoning anything else. Are you sure I'm speaking to Harino and not the Uzumaki brat? This is incredibly foolhardy. Can it? I'm doing the best with what I have, and I do have a shield I can hold in front of me until I get there. Orochimaru looked as though he meant to argue more, but surprisingly kept his mouth shut. He began going through another series of hand signs, and Sakura braced herself for whatever he had planned. I'll make an opening for you, Harino, but wind jutsu was never really my best element. Sakura blinked, trying to figure out just what exactly Orochimaru had planned, before his hand slammed to the ground and all Sakura could see were scales. An enormous snake seemed to spring from the ground, launching itself at Sasori. Puppets attempted to stop it, but Sakura merely lowered Kazayari to shield the snake's face, as well as herself. The snake only stopped when it reached the other wall, slamming into it with enough force to cause chunks of the ceiling to start raining down on them. Bold, but it had gotten her there quickly. Sakura felt a pang of empathy for the snake, but only briefly as Sasori was right there, and she had only a moment to react before long blades were lashing out at her from Sasori's back. Right. Puppet body. She had to assume that it was completely decked out in traps and weapons and poisons. She only just had enough time to block the blade with her metal arm bracers, and she was greeted with her first up-close look at the Akatsuki member. She could see the wooden grains in his skin now that she was closer, but even so, she could see how it could be mistaken for flesh from a distance. Her thoughts lingered briefly on what it meant for Sasori to have made this body for himself, crafting it in his own image, or maybe the image he'd wanted to remain. Sakura could never become a puppet. But creating an ideal version of yourself, perhaps that she could understand. So it is between you and I now. Sasori spoke, his voice so even that Sakura wondered if he was capable of expressing emotion at all. I will admit that I am not displeased with these events. With all the strength you have shown, you really will make a fine addition to my army. Sakura lashed out with her leg, and winced as it clashed against Sasori's own. It didn't sweep him as intended, which meant even his wooden legs had to have some reinforcement. But first, before you die, you will tell me what has become of Kisame and Itachi Uchiha. Sakura paused, looking up into Sasori's eyes in shock. Wait, what do you mean, what happened to Kisame and Itachi? And then, for the first time, Sakura saw emotion on Sasori's wooden face. His eyes expanded, clearly also taken off guard. Sasori had been so certain that she'd known about Itachi and Kisame, but why? Weren't they part of Akatsuki too? If Sasori didn't know where they were, then what had happened to them? The downside to fighting alongside shinobi that he'd only just met was that he had no idea how to work his jutsu around them. Not for lack of effort, of course. Sai was nothing if not professional, and regardless of how he felt about Sasuke Uchiha, they were allies, and he'd be the bigger person and ensure he worked well with them. But not even Sakura was so strange as to sprout wings and literally take off the ground in pursuit of a flying enemy, and Sai just wasn't sure how best to arc his birds so that they didn't hit Sasuke's unruly wings in the process. But maybe it was for the best. He was simple backup, after all, and if Uchiha could handle things on his own, there wasn't much point getting in the way. Karin was just about done with the evacuation, and from there the two of them could handle the fight. Still, he wanted to be the one fighting Deidara, especially now that he knew Deidara was a fighter with similar strengths and styles to his own. He'd been itching for a real fight for days since leaving the Hagashisai behind, a chance to prove himself, a chance to show the skills he'd learned and the techniques he'd mastered. Through his scope, he saw Deidara suddenly dip and swerve out of Sasuke's way. He'd stopped summoning his smaller birds, but he could still see the man's hands dipping into the pouches of clay at his hip. Was he working on something bigger? Much bigger. The bomb that Deidara pulled forward was triple the size of the last one he'd pulled out, a strange little statue with folded arms. "Oi, Uchiha!" he heard the man call out. "Can you occupy yourself with this for a little bit? I've got someone else I need to chat with first." Over the comms, he heard Sasuke grunt, "Typical, really," but only silence afterwards as Deidara's stone figure suddenly began to expand. It grew bigger and bigger as Deidara dropped it, big enough to become ominous. Big enough that Sai knew, instinctively, that he did not want to let that thing explode. "Try a taste of my C3, you Uchiha shit." Sai began to draw, furiously working on something big, but could he paint something big enough to catch it in time? He'd never done big before, never done anything large enough to take on a building-sized bomb. Maybe the civilians were out of the picture, but a bomb of that size could take out half the city, let alone cause the underground tunnels below to collapse from the pressure. He saw Sasuke fly beneath the bomb, lightning chakra bursting from his hands, but would it be enough to disable something so large? Before he could wonder further, he saw something golden shoot from the ground. Long chains sprouted from somewhere, someone, wrapping around the falling bomb and halting its fall. Sai focused his scope, and he saw Karin on the ground below, chains coming from her. What the fuck kind of jutsu had she been working on? Was this another of Orochimaru's experimentations? No. Sai vaguely recalled reading something on the Uzumaki adamantine chains, something that Naruto hadn't developed, but maybe Karin. Either way, the bomb had been slowed, though Sai knew there was no way Karin could hold the weight of it forever. Sasuke needed to find a way to neutralize it and fast, and meanwhile. Found ya. Sai's head whipped forward as Deidara's bird came to a halt in front of him. He kept his ink at the ready, but Deidara wasn't attacking? Getting the high ground, huh? Pretty smart, took me a while to put it together. Now that Uchiha's occupied. Deidara pushed his hands forward, showing a dozen small birds at the ready. You gonna show me what you can do? We're supposed to be fighting, aren't we? Well, yeah, but that doesn't mean we can't show off a little first, right? Everyone always shits on my art, and here you are with your own little version. I want to see you really work. Show me your art, don't hold anything back. Sai hesitated, looking down at the birds in Deidara's hand before glancing at his own scroll. His attempt at something large was mostly finished, but Deidara was giving him what he wanted. Deidara was giving him a fight. One-on-one, personal, no irritating Sasuke to get in the way. Alright, maybe this was what he'd really wanted this whole time. And it would take Karin and Sasuke a while to disable that bomb, and Sakura would tell him to keep Deidara occupied while they did so. Sai let his eyes narrow, and he began to sketch at a rapid pace. He saw Deidara grin as he began. That's more like it. Let's light the fucking sky up, Sai forced his mount to dive, sending off a wave of his inked birds as he did. Deidara responded with his own dive and his own clay birds, firing one off for every one he drew, until the air around them began to grow hot from the clash of explosions and scorching ink. It was a furious exchange of blows, but there was something of a dance to it, something Sai had only come to understand when seeing two dueling masters fight who had been sparring with each other for years. It wasn't that he'd known Deidara forever, but how he fought was so similar to his own style that he could almost predict every bird Deidara sent, every direction the attacks would come from, because it was so similar to what he would have done. Their mounts circled each other in the tailspin, only pulling out of the dive at the last possible moment to send them soaring across the rooftops of the city. There was going to be collateral damage fighting this low, but at this point Sai was more focused on staying alive than worrying about anything around him. One wrong move and Deidara's birds would be on him, one moment of hesitation and he'd be dead in the air. And it was thrilling, exhilarating in a way that none of his fights had been before. Kenjutsu sparring had been new, but it had never really been his forte in the way his ink had been. Nobody had matched his birds quite like this, and maybe nobody else was capable. Art, Deidara called it. Sakura had called it art as well, though Sai had really only thought of it as utility before. Rude had shunned the use of his ink for something like art, so much so that he'd painted his brother's story in secret, painted for pleasure only when he was far beyond Rude's influence. Now, even under fire, even with death so close at hand, now Sai was really experiencing the art form. It ended far too soon, with the echoing thud of the now disabled C3 bomb as it slammed into the ground, but didn't explode. Sasuke's lightning chakra had done its work, and now Sai could see the Uchiha rushing to catch up with them. Deidara pushed higher in the air, attempting to leave Uchiha behind, but there was no saving it. The dance had ended almost as quickly as it had begun, and now this time Karen was pushing in as backup. Fuck. He heard Deidara curse. I suppose you can't ask them to back off for a bit. We are supposed to be fighting. Oh come on, you can't tell me you weren't enjoying it. I know that look in your eyes. The Uchiha don't understand, they just don't get it. All he's going to do is ruin the fun. Sai looked back at Sasuke, seeing his outspread wings and crackling sword. Yes, Sasuke certainly wasn't the artistic type. More brute force, unrelenting power, and speed. Sasuke was likely planning on breaking a few of Deidara's bones for daring to drop a bomb of that size on him, and then maybe a few more to get whatever information he could on Itachi. But it didn't have to be like that, did it? Sai thought back to when Sakura had spoken to him for the first time. They'd been enemies, then, or so he'd thought. She, the deserter. He, the investigator, and potential executioner. She'd held out her food to him and told him he was welcome to walk at their side. Sakura, who'd tamed the savage Ichibai Jinhiriki. Sakura, who'd wrestled the shinobi nations into peace under her watch. Sakura who'd freed him. Maybe I can be like her. It doesn't have to be like this. He called out to Deidara. We could have all the time in the world to share our art, if we weren't enemies. Even through the rush of flight, he saw hesitation in Deidara's eyes, and perhaps a sense of longing. Sakura had insisted, through Haiden's testimony, that Deidara didn't want to be part of Akatsuki. And yet, Deidara's gaze turned into resignation. Sorry, but the world just doesn't work like that. I've got my obligations, you know. His hands filled with clay spiders, and Sai could sense that the real battle was about to begin again. What you all fail to understand is that I'm not the scariest thing Akatsuki has to offer. It clicked in Sai's head all at once. Understanding and determination in one smooth motion. He's trapped under his master, just like I was. And Sai decided then and there that he was going to set him free. Check the description for the links to the author.